fire. Our continuing live reports from Tripoli from John Dunvan, bringing us up to date. John, what's the latest?
Very, very quiet now compared to what we went through about an hour and a half ago. Even the busy traffic that began rushing around on the street seems to have calmed down. Lights were on all over the city immediately after the attack, people waking up and trying to figure out what was going on. Those lights are turning back off as people seem to be going back to sleep. We have no official word from the Libyans whatsoever on their version of what happened. We can only tell you what we saw and went through and heard, which was an enormous barrage, which began at about 7 o'clock Eastern time here, lasted for about 20 minutes. We could hear planes flying overhead, their engines screeching as they swooped and dove, although the feeling is they didn't dive that closely. It seems they were perhaps rocketing from some distance. The Libyans put up a very noisy, but I don't know if it was a very effective defense. Anti-aircraft fire was sending red tracer bullets up into the dark sky. All over the city, it seemed people were firing machine guns at the sky, but obviously that is not the kind of weaponry that can do any damage to a jet. And then 20 minutes later, it ended quite quickly. The jets flew away. The Libyan gunfire went on for another 5 or 10 minutes, just sporadic firing here or there, which sounded almost like street battles, but obviously was not. And then it died away. After that, the city woke up. Lights went on everywhere. Except in our hotel where someone pulled the plug and the lights went out and it is still dark here. Out on the streets, we saw troops moving around in jeeps, people hopping into cars and screeching around corners, going from one place to another. This traffic, this suddenly awakened city was going through a very busy period. I think it's very likely that the people who are in the military reserves were being called up and called to their duty stations. And now that phase is over. It is quiet again. Lights have been turned off. Street lights in some areas have now been turned off in a partial blackout, but generally the feeling is that it has passed away, and the shock that this city went through, which was astounding, now seems to be passing off somewhat. But no official word, I'm afraid, from the government. We can't turn on the television here to see if there is any special broadcast because we don't have power. I'm afraid the lights have been pulled.
John, there were reports, obviously, over the last week throughout the Western world that some sort of strike against Libya or some sort of sanctions or something was in the works or at least under consideration. This can't have come as a surprise in Libya, or can it? What was the preparation over the weekend, if any, for something such as this?
The mood, I think, was that the discussion of a military strike on this city was somehow unreal and was somehow not believable and was confined to the realm of rhetoric, threat, and posture. And the Libyans all week have been very friendly to us with no real expectation that our government would attack their... So, by the way, we're now seeing spotlights searching the sky out on the horizon. A spotlight just swept past, and that's the first time we saw that. We don't have any evidence or hear any evidence of planes returning. So I can't say that the Libyans are searching the sky on some sort of tip that the planes are coming back, but that's the first time we've seen that. And as I've said, the city has now gone into a partial blackout. There are more dark areas as I look out than I've seen before. So if there's going to be a second wave, I'm sure the Libyans will be more prepared, but we don't have any evidence of that beginning.
Have you seen any ambulance activity or any evidence that there might be casualties or people hurt or sirens, that kind of thing?
I have to tell you, we're in a hotel and we're not allowed to move out of it. We don't hear any sirens on ambulances anywhere, but that doesn't mean that there are no casualties. Often in this part of the world, ambulances just move through traffic by honking their horns, and also there wasn't that much traffic on the street to begin with. We know that the hospitals have been put on alert here within the last 24 hours and that they were restocking on medical supplies and blood, their supplies of blood. But we don't have any information whatsoever, I'm afraid, on civilian casualties or military casualties.
John, you've been in and out of Libya reporting on Gaddafi and what he has done in the past. What do you think he will do? Larry Speake said tonight that there was quite a lot of evidence that Gaddafi was planning more attacks, which prompted our strike against them tonight. What will Gaddafi do next?
I think Gaddafi will feel that the holy war has finally been declared, and I think it's quite unlikely, given the mood of the people here, given their attitude towards the United States and what they've been led to believe is the United States' role in the world, that they are going to say, all right, we've been taught a lesson and now we're going to stop. I think this is probably, in the Libyans' mind, only the opening round, and that they have, in their minds, been turned into the victim. They will see themselves as David having been pounded by a major Goliath, and they will see no dishonor in carrying out attacks such as they've been accused of in the past. I think they will probably see only honor in that because of what they went through here tonight.
John, just a few short weeks ago in the Gulf of Sidra, Gaddafi was able to turn that around to his benefit, or so it seemed in that part of the world, where we attacked their radar installation and the small ships out in the Gulf of Sidra who were poised to strike at our fleet. Do you think they will attempt to do the same thing this time to make it look like they are still coming out on top of this fray?
I don't think they'll be able to do that this time. We had some discussion here earlier in the evening that if the U.S. sailed away from this potential confrontation without striking a blow, that Gaddafi would then have said, look, we chased the U.S. away and we mobilized world support against the Americans. I think now that he's been hit, there probably is no way that he can try to turn this into a victory, and if he's going to play some sort of political game with it, he will probably play the game of the victim and try to stress the fact that he was attacked from outside by a nation that traveled 6,000 miles to do it, and he will try to rally support on the fact that he suffered a defeat here. But he will try to keep some honor in the defeat by pointing out that he was massively outgunned, and by pointing out that many European nations don't agree that a strong enough case was made linking Gaddafi to the recent terror attacks. And he'll play the victim, I think, and try to get as much out of that as he can.
John Donovan, thank you for the latest update from Tripoli, and we will be talking to you again throughout the evening as CNN's live coverage continues of the story, which is breaking tonight. For anyone just joining us, the U.S. has struck Libya, 2 targets in Libya, Tripoli and Benghazi. Larry Speaks from the White House said earlier this evening at about 7:20, apparently the attacks happened at about 7 o'clock Eastern time, our time, about 2 a.m. Tripoli time. So Larry Speaks came on to answer reporters' questions about 20 minutes after they had started, about 5 minutes after the attack had ended. It was supposedly against targets, military targets, and terrorist centers. We are finding out as much as we can from our live reports from our reporters as we continue covering the story.
And we'll be on throughout the evening with continuing live coverage. Part of that will include at 9 p.m. Eastern Time a short address by the president from the White House live, said to be about 10 minutes, and the White House has been saying that the strike was in retaliation for terrorist attacks on Americans, and I'm sure President Reagan will expand on that. And after the president addresses the nation, Secretary Schultz and Weinberger will be in the White House briefing room, and CNN will be carrying their comments and their answers to reporters' questions live immediately following that. And we'll continue in a moment.
Stock market investors, now you can receive Value Line for only $50 and get our 2,000-page investors reference set as a gift. It brings you Value Line's latest research reports on 1,700 stocks ready for your instant use. You also get the next 10 weeks of complete Value Line service for only $50. Call us for your gift reference set and start Value Line coming every week. Take advantage of coming market changes. Call us now, 800-342-5856.
Entrepreneur, one who assumes the risks of business. Rockwell International managers have the entrepreneurial freedom to move through the maze of business challenges. With advanced technologies and innovative quality products, Rockwell International entrepreneurs get results.
Spring is in the air, so now you can clean out the attic, pull out the weeds, throw out your arm, or you can do something you really want to do. Take a trip on American Airlines, because they're having this Spring for Less sale. You see, American just lowered their Ultimate Super Saver fares, just $29 to $119 anywhere they fly in the continental U.S. You know, with fares this low, flying may become the great American pastime.
Who's ready to unchain the only gas turbo 4x4 truck in America? Who's ready to unleash pure horsepower and pulling power? Who's ready to beat up a mountain and muscle its way to the top? Toyota is who. The 1986 Toyota 4x4 Turbo with high-track independent front suspension for even more comfort. It's the who's who in 4x4s.
Who could ask for anything more? Toyota.
In just about 15 minutes, we are told the president will address the nation concerning the U.S. airstrikes against Libya tonight that happened just a little bit less than 2 hours ago. It is likely that this will create tremendous controversy in this country, certainly a lot of discussion. We will hear some of the controversy now in Washington from Tom Braden and Robert Novak. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Chris. In medias res, a brief crossfire. Our guest in the studio, Congressman Duncan Hunter, member of the House Armed Services Committee and a Republican. And in New York, Congressman Robert Torricelli, Democrat of New Jersey, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Bob?
Mr. Torricelli, from what you know and what you've heard, do you think that President Reagan did the right thing in ordering the strike on Gaddafi?
I think with his actions so far have been completely appropriate. We offered our European allies a chance to avoid this military confrontation if they would have entered into real diplomatic and economic sanctions. They didn't have the courage to do so. Given that reality, I think the president had no choice, and I think his response has been appropriate and measured.
Representative Hunter, do you think that the president's action will have any effect? It was a 15-minute airstrike, or do you think this starts a long series of chain of reprisals and retaliation?
You know, I think a lot of this depends on Gaddafi's internal situation. He's not totally secure in his own country, and Gaddafi could very well come out of this encounter being more worried about his own political survival in Libya than retaliating against Americans.
Congressman Torricelli, let me ask you, the president has always been, repeatedly has said that he will not strike unless he is sure that he will strike at the people who did the job. Now, are you waiting for his address to see whether these reports that Libya was engaged in an attempted assassination of an American ambassador hold water?
Well, I think the president has some obligation to come forward with the evidence. I believe that he probably has it, or he wouldn't have taken these actions. But in answer to your question, I think there is some need for him to come forward with that exact evidence.
You know, Mr. Torricelli, a lot of Europeans really feel that the president is the old cowboy off on a tear. He doesn't have the American people behind him. For those who might not know, you are a strong liberal Democrat. You were a former member of the staff of Walter Mondale when he was vice president, I believe. For you to support him, does that indicate that there is a very, very broad base of support for the president on this in the Congress on both sides of the aisle?
I don't think you're going to find any divisions in this Congress in either house on this issue. There's been a tremendous frustration rising in the American people on the subject of terrorism, and we needed an appropriate response, and this is it. It is certainly not the end of it. We are engaged in a very long and difficult struggle with terrorism. And I would caution, too, that I hope the president makes clear to the American people that Gaddafi is an important part of the terrorist problems in this world, but he's not all of it. We can't allow ourselves to think that because we're striking against Gaddafi, that's going to end terrorism, either with Libya or with the problem at large.
What about that, Congressman
Just a minute,
Hunter?
Tom. I've just gotten a report from Reuters, the news service, which says that a number of Colonel Gaddafi's relatives were injured in the attack.
They bombed his headquarters.
Yeah, so does that look as though, you remember the Armed Services Committee, Congressman Hunter, does it look as though this was an attack aimed at getting out some of the ruling power structure in Libya?
I don't think so. I think if you wanted to get out the ruling power structure, of course, you'd take Gaddafi out. The strikes were at his headquarters. They were at nerve centers, control bases throughout Libya. And, of course, the problem is you can't make a strike like this, particularly a night strike at 2 o'clock in the morning, without the possibility of some people, some civilians being in those locations. But the United States had absolutely no alternative with regard to that. There was information to the effect that Gaddafi at one point was attempting to marshal American civilians or Westerners, Western civilians, to those particular locations. So we couldn't let him tie our hands, but let's wait for more information to come out from the president.
Let me ask you about this. Congressman Torricelli mentioned that this wasn't the end of terrorism, and that's quite clear. We have the Shiites, we have the Lebanese, we have various Muslim sects.
You have the Nicaraguans.
The Syrians, the Nicaraguans. We have all kinds of people engaged in terror. Will the American people or the Congress believe that this ends it, our strike at Gaddafi, we've ended terrorism?
No, I think that the American people realize that we are embarked on a new age in which terrorism is a way in which dictators, in which some countries that can't take us on in a frontal manner attempt to undermine the values and the potency of the Western world. They understand that you can take a nation in some cases, like the Beirut situation, and render a great power completely impotent. So terrorism will continue, and I think people realize
All right, Mr. Hunter, now let me ask you this. Will this increase terrorism as the Arab world becomes inflamed with the idea that the big bully hit them? Will there be more of it?
I think not. I think the Arab world has a number of people who are moderate, who understand that we have to live in this very, very close world, especially in the Mediterranean and Europe together. You have, of course, some fanatics such as the Ayatollah, Mr. Gaddafi, who are going to do everything they can to propagate terrorism regardless.
Let me ask you the same question. Do you think that this will increase terrorism, that as Arabs become inflamed, they will strike?
In the short term, I think the chances of Mr. Gaddafi striking back with other terrorist acts are almost certain. But there are a number of messages that go out tonight. One is to the Libyan people and the Libyan military. They are now in a struggle with the United States. Mr. Gaddafi got them into it. If they want to get out of it, they ought to think about what they're going to do with their government, what kind of support they're going to give to Gaddafi, and hopefully what they're going to do to get rid of him. That's the message to Gaddafi, to the Libyan people. In Europe, there's another message, too. Those who would trade with Gaddafi, those European nations that don't want us to strike militarily, need to rethink their policies about supporting him, about trading with him, about selling weapons to him. So I think a long term, this is an answer to terrorism, though I have no illusions that in the near future, Gaddafi is liable to strike back with more acts. But let him understand we're now in a new set of rules. The new set of rules are you strike the United States, you get struck back. Terrorism's operating on a new set of principles, and that is the United States may have bent for a while, but we don't break.
But in Lebanon, Congressman, where there are 100 and more sects, will this have any effect there?
Well, the long-term effect, again, has to be recognizing that this nation is going to find those responsible, and there's going to be a price to be paid. That is a message that's going to go far beyond Tripoli. It should be felt in Syria, and it should be felt in Beirut as well. We are going to answer when American citizens are hit, and we're going to answer hard.
Congressman Hunter, I believe that you and the Majority Leader of the Senate, Senator Dole, have a bill in to modify the War Powers Act, which was enacted by Congress during the Vietnam War and as a result of the Vietnam War, to limit the ability of the President of the United States to make war without the consent of Congress. Now, doesn't this strike indicate that it is entirely possible for the President to act under the War Powers Act?
Yes, I think so. I think the President can act, but one thing that's important, I think, is somebody indicated a reporting requirement early on. There really isn't one. There's one within 48 hours, but the President couldn't have possibly reported this strike in advance to the people of the U.S. Congress.
So you think he violated the War Powers Act?
No, I don't think he violated it. I say it was consistent with the War Powers Act, but the President, under the War Powers Act, can today only sustain strikes against a terrorist force for 90 days. At that point, he has to go to Congress and get permission.
Well, do you think that's not adequate?
I think it's inadequate. I think we've got to give the President of the United States, the one guy we all elect, back the powers to be the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces.
What do you think of that, Mr. Torricelli?
I think, if anything, that this action, the actions in the Gulf of Sidra, have proven that, in fact, the War Powers Act works. The President, under the current law, does have the flexibility to respond to attacks on Americans and to direct American armed forces. I think it's a workable law, and it's brought us together. The President properly today brought together the leaders of the Congress, of the relevant committees, to discuss the situation, and we were a stronger government because of it. We acted together as Democrats and Republicans, Congress and the administration.
Bob, let me interrupt you briefly. The President can act, but he can't act in a sustained fashion. And if those ships were to lay off the Gulf of Sidra, for over 60 days or over 90 days upon application for an extension, President Reagan would have to stop without the permission of Congress. So he can act in a very swift, sure strike that lasts for only several hours, but he can't maintain sustained actions against terrorists under the present situation.
I understand that, but it would be my own view that 60 to 90 days is enough for the president to act militarily and then make his case to the Congress and the American people. And at that point, if we are united in our purpose, we can go ahead with the policy. If there are sustained doubts among the American people and the Congress after 90 days, we had better rethink the policy. We've learned the failures of a country and divided going into military action.
Mr. Torricelli,
I think this is an act that brings us together.
We're almost out of time, Mr. Torricelli, and I want to ask you one quick question. Will this affect the vote on aid to the Contras in the House tomorrow?
It may, but it shouldn't. They are two different actions, and I hope that we look at them separately.
It should affect the vote for the very simple reason that Mr. Gaddafi has links, strong links with the Nicaraguan
Thank you very much, Duncan Hunter, Republican of California, Robert Torricelli of New Jersey, and Bernard Shaw.
Thank you very much, Bob. Now let's quickly go to the State Department and our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Ralph Begleiter.
Bernie, CNN has learned that the Reagan administration struck at 5 targets in Tripoli tonight, including a port facility at which commandos were trained by the Gaddafi government in terrorist tactics, and 2 sets of barracks in Tripoli and Benghazi, which served as headquarters, the so-called command and control areas that Larry Speaks referred to, Benghazi and Tripoli. In addition, the military section of Tripoli Airport was one of the targets tonight, and a military airfield where fighters and bombers of the Libyan Air Force were stationed at Benina were the other target. A total of 5 targets struck tonight by American bombers. In addition, sources here at the State Department say there are no additional strikes planned at this time. However, they say depending on Gaddafi's response in the future, there could be additional military strikes to prevent future terrorism. Ralph Begleiter, CNN, reporting live from the State Department.
Ralph, before you go away, what you've just reported to us, this first known information, this jives with what Larry Speaks termed targets which were part of Gaddafi's command and control system.
That's exactly right. Obviously, those 2 barracks were considered to be the headquarters of the terrorist control network, if you will, and then the port facility, the actual training area for some commandos, the military airfield, and the military portion of Tripoli Airport. The military airfield was what Speaks called a suppression target. That would have been to prevent Libyan planes from rising to counteract the American strike tonight.
And of course, we probably won't know for several days, Ralph Begleiter, the damage inflicted upon the Russian-supplied MiG jets.
We don't know at this point whether there was any damage at all, or whether this was just an attempt to put the operation out of order, in effect, temporarily. We don't have any damage reports here, at least, yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Ralph Begleiter, our Foreign Affairs correspondent, reporting live from the State Department. If you've been with us for the past 2 hours, we've been bringing you live events as they have unfolded. We've heard from our White House correspondent, Frank Cesno. We've heard from Mr. Begleiter. We've heard from several experts. We, as with you, are reacting to, talking about what we learned so far. There's still a lot more to be known, and we will get some official word from the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, who's had a very, very busy day, meeting with his top advisors and also meeting with the members of Congress, key congressional members from both houses, from the Senate, from the House. The President being briefed on what was going to happen. We heard from spokesman Larry Speaks. And now President Reagan is preparing to go before the nation and indeed the world from the Oval Office to explain what happened and why. Let's go now to the Oval Office for the President of the United States, who has come in and has settled in to tell us what's going to happen. Mr. Reagan had indicated, as you recall, in our coverage of his live news conference last week, that if American intelligence showed the way, the United States would be responding.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission. Several weeks ago in New Orleans, I warned Colonel Gaddafi we would hold his regime accountable for any new terrorist attacks launched against American citizens. More recently, I made it clear we would respond as soon as we determined conclusively who was responsible for such attacks. On April 5th, in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel. This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle Discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime. On March 25th, more than a week before the attack, orders were sent from Tripoli to the Libyan People's Bureau in East Berlin to conduct a terrorist attack against Americans to cause maximum and indiscriminate casualties. Libya's agents then planted the bomb. On April 4th, the People's Bureau alerted Tripoli that the attack would be carried out the following morning. The next day, they reported back to Tripoli on the great success of their mission. Our evidence is direct, it is precise, it is irrefutable. We have solid evidence about other attacks Gaddafi has planned against the United States installations and diplomats and even American tourists. Thanks to close cooperation with our friends, some of these have been prevented. With the help of French authorities, we recently aborted one such attack, a planned massacre using grenades and small arms of civilians waiting in line for visas at an American embassy. Colonel Gaddafi is not only an enemy of the United States, his record of subversion and aggression against the neighboring states in Africa is well documented and well known. He has ordered the murder of fellow Libyans in countless countries. He has sanctioned acts of terror in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as the Western Hemisphere. Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again. It gives me no pleasure to say that, and I wish it were otherwise. Before Gaddafi seized power in 1969, the people of Libya had been friends of the United States. And I'm sure that today most Libyans are ashamed and disgusted that this man has made their country a synonym for barbarism around the world. The Libyan people are a decent people, caught in the grip of a tyrant. To our friends and allies in Europe who cooperated in today's mission, I would only say, you have the permanent gratitude of the American people. Europeans who remember history understand better than most that there is no security, no safety in the appeasement of evil. It must be the core of Western policy that there be no sanctuary for terror. And to sustain such a policy, free men and free nations must unite and work together. Sometimes it is said that by imposing sanctions against Colonel Gaddafi or by striking at his terrorist installations, we only magnify the man's importance, that the proper way to deal with him is to ignore him. I do not agree. Long before I came into this office, Colonel Gaddafi had engaged in acts of international terror, acts that put him outside the company of civilized men. For years, however, he suffered no economic or political or military sanction, and the atrocities mounted in number, as did the innocent dead and wounded. And for us to ignore, by inaction, the slaughter of American civilians and American soldiers, whether in nightclubs or airline terminals, is simply not in the American tradition. When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond so long as I'm in this Oval Office. Self-defense is not only our right, it is our duty. It is the purpose behind the mission undertaken tonight, a mission fully consistent with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. We believe that this preemptive action against his terrorist installations will not only diminish Colonel Gaddafi's capacity to export terror, it will provide him with incentives and reasons to alter his criminal behavior. I have no illusion that tonight's action will ring down the curtain on Gaddafi's reign of terror. But this mission, violent though it was, can bring closer a safer and more secure world for decent men and women. We will persevere. This afternoon, we consulted with the leaders of Congress regarding what we were about to do and why. Tonight, I salute the skill and professionalism of the men and women of our armed forces who carried out this mission. It's an honor to be your commander-in-chief. We Americans are slow to anger. We always seek peaceful avenues before resorting to the use of force. And we did. We tried quiet diplomacy, public condemnation, economic sanctions, and demonstrations of military force. None succeeded. Despite our repeated warnings, Gaddafi continued his reckless policy of intimidation, his relentless pursuit of terror. He counted on America to be passive. He counted wrong. I warned that there should be no place on earth where terrorists can rest and train and practice their deadly skills. I meant it. I said that we would act with others if possible and alone if necessary to ensure that terrorists have no sanctuary anywhere. Tonight, we have. Thank you. God bless you.
President Reagan concluding his live remarks from the Oval Office, addressing the nation and the world, explaining why the United States took the action it has taken against Libya. The president at one point saying, "Our evidence is direct, precise, and is irrefutable." There is much reaction in this capital to what has happened over in Libya. From the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, our guest is Dr. Henry Schuler. This man is a Libyan expert. What is happening in your judgment in the higher councils of the Gaddafi regime at this hour?
Well, I should think that the Gaddafi regime has certainly experienced something that they had not really and truly anticipated. Whether it will have the desired effect of stopping terrorism, of deterring Gaddafi, I seriously doubt. I am also fearful that it will not result in the overthrow of Gaddafi, which has to be our objective. But having said that, it is entirely clear that only the commander-in-chief can make the decision that the evidence is adequate, that the targets are appropriate, and that we could pull off a surgical strike.
Any thoughts about Middle East backlash?
Well, there certainly will be a great deal of lip service paid to Arab solidarity, and Gaddafi will utilize that within the country to prove that Libya is not isolated from its neighbors. In fact, Gaddafi has succeeded in isolating the country, but I have feared that military action allows him to break out of his isolation.
What might he do next?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I don't think he will be deterred, and I think we must be on our guard everywhere, and we must now embark on a program that is designed to bring about the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. We must renew our efforts at economic sanctions. There are 5 American oil companies that are still producing oil in Libya, paying taxes to Gaddafi to purchase the missiles to fire at American aircraft. It seems to me that we must get them out of there before we can even hope that our allies will follow suit, or before we can hope that American individuals will leave. If the companies can remain, the individuals will argue that they can remain. We have taken a military step tonight. I hope we follow it up with what is unfortunately a more difficult policy to pursue, one that involves perseverance and coordination.
Mr. Schuler, we have been reporting over the last months and in fact years of the importance of OPEC and the activities of OPEC and in many cases the inactivity of OPEC. Most recently there are problems over whether to and how to put a cap on production. Tell us what you think the effect of what has happened tonight will have on OPEC, on the cartel, and then in turn on American consumers.
Well, it should be clear that Gaddafi led the price explosion in the 1970s. He and the companies that capitulated to his demands created the price explosion of the 1970s. Now it seems to me that he has made it clear that he wants once again to see higher oil prices. And so Gaddafi, along with Ayatollah Khomeini, are the principal proponents of restoring the price of oil to $28 a barrel. And there is a bitter split within OPEC. And how this incident will play out, I think it's too early to tell, but it will very definitely be a factor in the decision-making of the OPEC nations as a whole.
Mr. Schuler, you've spent a lot of time in that part of the country. A comment, if you would, sir, on President Reagan's statement tonight. If you heard in his speech just a few moments ago, he said, in effect, that since Gaddafi took over in 1969, our relations with Libya have all been all non-existent. But before that, we had good relations. And he placed all the problem in the hands of Gaddafi, not the people of Libya. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's an entirely valid assessment. Gaddafi came to power determined to remove the influence of Western powers in his country, and he has achieved that. He is determined to try and remove the United States from the Mediterranean, and in fact has gotten the United States out of, and NATO out of naval bases in Malta. So I think that it's certainly true that Gaddafi has caused a strain in relations. But the president was absolutely right in one thing, and that was that people have said, why don't we just ignore him? And that he will not be a problem if we don't make him a problem. Unfortunately, this is the policy that was been pursued for 12 of the last 17 years. And it has resulted, as the president said, in Gaddafi believing that he is invincible and will continue to probe for our weaknesses.
Dr. Schuler, that might be Muammar Gaddafi's belief, but I'm wondering why? Why has this man been allowed to rise to the levels he has achieved? And I'm wondering whether or not fear of Islamic fundamentalism on the part of moderate Arab states has been a factor.
Well, certainly he does represent something of the same phenomenon as Ayatollah Khomeini, of being a very assertive, belligerent, non-compromising force in the Arab world. And indeed, that has an appeal in that part of the world. And we have not learned to come to grips with it, and we must learn to come to grips with it along with terrorism if, in fact, we are to have peace in the coming decades.
I'd like to interrupt you, gentlemen, for just a moment. As part of our continuing coverage of this story tonight, we may interrupt each other and our guests momentarily to bring you the latest information we're getting in. And the latest reports we have now are reports about Libyan radio, which is saying that several members of the family of Muammar Gaddafi have been injured in the U.S. strikes. There is no confirmation. Again, this is from Libyan radio. The report was by the Voice of the Greater Arab Homeland. It was a broadcast monitored in Britain. It was Libya's first confirmation, at least, that the attacks did occur. This announcement on Libyan radio that several family members of Muammar Gaddafi have been injured. Again, this is unconfirmed. Also, the official news agency TASS has commented now on the attacks by the United States. I'll just read to you what they've said. The first paragraph of the news flash was dated at Tripoli, Libya, said the Libyan capital has been subjected to an air attack. Explosions are heard in the city. There have been no denunciations, just those reports that it has happened from TASS. We will continue with our updates. Right now, we continue with Bernie in Washington. Bernie.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have just a matter of time to thank our guest, Dr. Henry Schuler, a Libyan expert from the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. We thank you, sir. And we now stand by. The Reagan administration is continuing to provide more amplification on what's been happening and the rationales for the action taken tonight. We're going to be hearing from Secretaries of State George Shultz and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. That briefing preparing to get underway right now, so we stand by for that as we continue our live coverage of this breaking story.
It's the Spring Savings Spectacular at Renault and Jeep dealers. Save up to $1,144 with 7.7% financing on every new Alliance and Encore. Save hundreds more with an automatic transmission at no extra cost. Or save hundreds on other special value packages. And get 5-year, 50,000-mile protection. Save now with 7.7 financing. Don't miss this limited time offer. See your Renault and Jeep dealer today.
Now to the press briefing room. Secretary of State Schultz, National Security Advisor Poindexter off the wings, and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger.
The President has just described an act of self-defense on the part of the United States. The action was proportionate to the sustained, clear, continuing, and widespread use of terror against Americans and others by Gaddafi's Libya. As the President said, we must remember, and of course Europeans particularly remember, that tolerance or appeasement of aggression has historically brought more aggression. In Gaddafi's case, what we have seen over a period of years and escalating in recent months is a continuing increase in the use of terror. So this is not a question of something that we have done being countered by something he has done and so on. It has been an escalation by Gaddafi that has called forward this act of self-defense on the part of the United States. So under these circumstances, the President decided that it was time to act, and he did. Secretary Weinberger will describe more precisely what the action was. At about 7 p.m. Eastern Time, elements, medium units of the 3rd Air Force attacked targets in the western Libyan zone, and at the same time, A-6s from the America and the Coral Sea attacked targets in the eastern Libya zone as listed here. The targets of the western zone were the military airport near Tripoli, the Azizia barracks, which are a command and control headquarters of the Libyan terrorist activities, and Sidi Bilal, which is a training area, including a maritime diver training unit for terrorists in the west. In the east, the Jamahira barracks, which is an alternate command post from the Azizia barracks, was also attacked, and the Benina Air Base, from which defensive, suppressive activities and air defense would be mounted, was attacked. We used a combination of 500-pound and 2,000-pound laser-guided weapons and precision-guided delayed gravity bombs. And all of the Navy planes have returned without casualty. All of the F-111s, with one exception, have been accounted for and are returning. There is one that is not accounted for at this time. They will reach their, recover to their home bases somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 a.m. Eastern Time. The bomb damage assessment at the moment is limited, and we've not had full reports, but we do know that at Benina Air Base, the base was closed. They were unable to launch any aircraft. They had no lights, no radar, no communication as a result of the attack. We will have very full reports of the attack as the F-111s return to their bases in the early morning, and we will have more precise bomb damage assessments at that time. The attack was carried out precisely as planned, and it was, as the President said, evidence of very great skill, both the navigational as well as the organization of the attack, which was a difficult one from the professional point of view, and done with a great effectiveness. And we should have the full reports of the bomb damage assessment at that time. All of the targets were terrorist-related, and the criteria for selecting the targets was that they would be had a full terrorist connection, that we would minimize any collateral damage from civilian or other facilities nearby, that we would have full consideration for the safety of the pilots as a major consideration, and that they would be good night targets in the sense that they had good outlines that could be reflected on the radar and not mistaken for other targets.
Was there an effort, sir, to get Gaddafi personally?
No, there was not.
Family had been injured.
There was, we don't know anything about those reports. They're from the Libyan radio.
Mr. Secretary,
How many people do you think you killed?
We have no idea that we killed anybody.
Mr. Secretary, do you believe that that F-111 was shot down?
We don't have any indication to the fact at all. It's simply not accounted for at this time.
But other than it having been shot down, what other explanation could there be for not hearing?
Well, there are any one of a number of explanations. It could have radio trouble. It could be going to another base because of the radio trouble. It could have had an internal problem, an internal explosion. But there's no indication that there was it went down or was a victim of any enemy fire or anything of the kind.
There was also a report, sir, that you hit part of the French embassy in Libya. Do you know anything about that?
No, that would be, I think, virtually impossible. Yes.
Approve the F-111s taking off from British soil?
I'm sorry?
Did Mrs. Thatcher approve the F-111s taking off from British soil?
Yes, permission was granted.
Can you tell us, sir, when the decision was made to proceed with this operation?
Over a considerable period of time as the evidence mounted and as the discussions were held.
Mr. Secretary, the number of aircraft involved.
I'm sorry?
Could you give us the number of aircraft
Yes,
involved?
there were about 18 F-111s initially that were planned for, and there were about 15 A6s and 7s, and supporting aircraft in addition to that in the form of tankers, the E-2Cs, the fighter cover, and various other missions that were flown at the same time. A very considerable number. I don't have the exact total. Could you put up the other chart? This is the route that was followed by the F-111s from the bases in England at Mendenhall and Lakenheath and Upper Hayford, and the tankers followed along down there, and they went through that as a total of about 2,800 nautical miles.
Was the Soviet Union told in advance?
Can you say if there was any permanent damage intended or likely to be inflicted by this, or is this really just a temporary?
Not on this scale. There was certainly no slight suggestion that it was any gesture of any kind. It was intended to do exactly as Secretary Schultz and the President said.
Was the Soviet Union informed?
They were informed, but George, you want to handle the time?
The Soviet Union was told that we had conclusive evidence of Libyan involvement in terrorist activity, including the Berlin bombing. At the time of the military operation, that is, as it was taking place, the Soviet charge here, the senior Soviet in Washington, was called in and told of the operation. He was told why, he was told of our evidence, and he was told that this action was directed against Libyan terrorism and was in no way directed against the Soviet Union.
Mr. Secretary, to what extent do you think this settles the score with Libya, sir? To what extent do you think this settles the score with Libya?
Not a question of settling scores. It's a question of acting against terrorism, of saying to terrorists that the acts they perpetrate will cost them. If you raise the costs, you do something that should eventually act as a deterrent. And that is the primary objective, to defend ourselves both in the immediate sense and prospectively.
Secretary, what steps have been taken now in the wake of this attack in order to increase the security around United States embassies abroad, especially in the Middle East?
All of our embassies are on alert, of course. We have reports and indications, quite substantial evidence, of Libyan efforts to attack, varying degrees of certainty on the evidence, up to 30 of our embassies. So when I say that Gaddafi's planning is widespread, the evidence is quite clear that it is.
Recent planning?
Yes,
absolutely.
Mr. Secretary, I would also add that the military installations around the world are also on full alert for attacks, terrorist attacks of any kind from any quarter.
If we had such good evidence and if we have such good intelligence about this, particularly what the spokesman and the president have said tonight, why were we unable to stop that Berlin attack if we knew one had been ordered the day before?
We knew that they had ordered an attack in Berlin. Berlin's a big place. And we were in the process of trying to track down, and I think in Berlin and in other places, through the intelligence we collected, through the cooperation with other countries and their intelligence, we have been able to abort and stop a number of terrorist acts. And in this case, we were not able to identify the particular disco and get people cleaned out in time.
We were within 15 minutes, according to General Rogers, of getting notifications with respect to this particular installation as to the fact that it was potentially a dangerous area.
Let's Secretary's asking for a little order, and I concur that he should.
Okay, right here.
If you raise your hands, he will call on you.
Okay, I've called on him.
In light of the Syrian government's pledge to back the Libyan government in this crisis, are we now also on the alert for any Syrian-sponsored acts of terrorism directed against the United States?
We are on the alert for any acts of terrorism against the United States, and of course, we have a collaborative pattern with other countries, and we're as concerned about terrorism against others as we are about ourselves.
Following up, you indicated that we now have evidence that the Libyans were planning terrorist attacks against up to 30 U.S. embassy or diplomatic facilities.
That's right.
Do we have any evidence of Syrian planning to attack or launch terrorist attacks on Americans or American facilities?
I have nothing that I'm prepared to talk about on that score at all. On the other hand, Syria has made the statement that you quoted. To what that will turn out to mean remains to be seen.
Secretary, why do we stand alone among the Allies, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher, apparently? Why did the European community caution us against retaliating, if our evidence is so good?
With respect to our allies, we have a variety of opinions, and I would have to say, having talked with a great many of them recently, opinions vary within those governments. And I think, in general, what we see is a shift in the direction of seeing very clearly what Gaddafi is, what he is doing, and gradually, more and more coming to the conclusion that something needs to be done about it. Today, the European community foreign ministers met. They were not apprised of what we were going to do, although some of those governments were aware of our plans, obviously the British. And they stepped up, in effect, their attitude of condemnation of Libya. They singled Libya out by name. So there is movement, but as you say, they do not yet share our conviction that action of this kind is necessary.
Was there a Soviet response from the Chargé here or from any other quarter?
Other countries will have to speak for themselves, including the Soviet Union.
Mr. Secretary, Secretary Weinberger,
Yes.
looking at the route followed by the aircraft.
Yes.
Is that route evasive action, or is that to avoid flying over the soil of allies that might...
Well, obviously, if we had permission to fly a direct route, we would have not subjected the pilots to quite such a long flight. But given the available routes that we had, we left England and we reached Libya. It would have been, obviously, from an operational point of view, less risk to the pilots and a quicker time than it took to go the 2,800 nautical miles to get in there. There were, when a route of that kind is chosen, you also try to do as much as you can by changes of altitudes and so on to have the maximum evasiveness.
Yeah. 2,800 miles is an awfully long flight.
It is a very long flight. It is
if you would add permission for overflights on other countries' soil, how short?
Oh, we would have probably saved maybe close to 1,200 nautical miles. Down and 1,200 back.
Range of an F-111.
Well, it's refueled. Its range is virtually unlimited as long as you can refuel it, and they were refueled many times.
Was permission sought?
I'm sorry?
Was permission sought for example, from France and denied?
Well, I think that's a fair description.
Other countries as well?
What if this does
I'm
not...
sorry, you had a follow-up. Yeah.
Other countries as well?
No, that was what was that would have been the direct route.
Can you explain, the President cited, for example, that the French assisted in uncovering...
That was an earlier case. They did indeed. Yeah.
What if this does not deter Gaddafi and terrorism continue? What then?
That gets us into the hypotheticals, and as you know, I try not to deal with those. The President, I think, made it very clear that he didn't feel that this would necessarily automatically spell the end of terrorism. But I think it will send an unmistakable signal, and I think it will go very far towards deterring future acts. As the President said, we're prepared to take other action if it does not.
I'd like to follow that up, if I may, sir, by asking Secretary Schultz. You were the one who said that this was not a ratcheting up, or words to that effect, but a response in self-defense. But what if Gaddafi strikes back? Do we not then have to ratchet up our military response?
We will take the action that is wise as we see the situation unfold. What is clear tonight is that the United States will take military action under certain circumstances. That's established. That's very important. Now, the situation will unfold and we'll see where we go from there.
Secretary Schultz, how much operational damage, though, does this do to Gaddafi and the terrorist operation? I mean, how long does this put him out of business? I guess what I'm asking is it an operational damage or a psychological blow that you're hoping to strike here?
Of course, we don't have any real damage assessment as yet, and we will get that, and we'll know more precisely what happened. But we seek to reduce his capability of carrying on terrorist acts, and I'm sure to some degree that was done. And we also have registered the point with him and with other Libyans that they will pay a price, that there is a cost to engaging in terrorism around the world. So they know that.
Mr. Secretary, did Mrs. Thatcher give...
One more question, and he's pointing to you.
Go ahead.
This is the last question.
Did Mrs. Thatcher give unqualified support, or did she set limits on what she was prepared to allow these planes to do?
Mrs. Thatcher had obviously many questions and concerns, and they were expressed, and the response was made to them, and permission was given to do what was done.
There are additional reports that the French embassy has been hit in Tripoli.
That I don't think could be accurate reports because of the nature of the targets and the nature of the ordnance used.
Our planes counter defensive fire. Our planes under fire.
What about the oil installations?
Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of State George Shultz putting some flesh tonight on the United States strike against Libya, Benghazi, and the city of Tripoli. Your network of record will continue its live coverage of this breaking story in a moment.
You think you're looking at just another charge card? Well, look again. This is Diners Club from Citicorp. The more you use it, the more you're rewarded with free gifts, such as a night on the town, or a video recorder, or free flights on United Airlines, or even an African safari. No other card offers the business person free rewards like this. But then no other card is the club. Citicorp Diners Club. Welcome to the club.
To apply, call 1-800-CLUB-INFO.
Dr. Klein, code blue.
The crisis for medical people today is how bogged down they are on non-medical activity. That's why hospitals are turning to cost-efficient computer systems from Burroughs Corporation. Systems that allow doctors and nurses to send and receive life-saving information instantly, so they can concentrate on patients, not paperwork. Burroughs computers were brought into hospitals to save money, but they wound up saving something a lot more important.
This is Joelle, Jo for short. Just 1 year ago, she lay dying from a narcotic overdose. But Joelle was lucky. She was given a remarkable antidote developed by DuPont that literally saved her life. The rest, however, was up to her. At the Pharmaceuticals Division of DuPont, we think of our antidote as a sort of second chance. Joelle got that chance, and oh, what she's done with it.
DuPont, better things for better living.
Now, for the power computer user who demands performance, Radio Shack introduces the Tandy 3000.
the more powerful and more affordable IBM PC AT compatible. Here's the power to manage your business, utilize computer networking, or create a multi-user system. The Tandy 3000, the power to put you in command. Tandy, clearly superior, in business for business. Only at Radio Shack Computer Centers.
If you are just joining us on CNN, we would like to tell you we have just heard in live reports from Washington from the Secretary of State Schultz and from Secretary of Defense Weinberger and from the President on tonight's U.S. strikes against various targets in Libya. There have been a couple items which we'd like to bring you up to date on. One is that there were at least 18 F-111s which helped to carry out these strikes. All of them but one have returned to their respective bases. Secretary of State Weinberger says there could be a number of explanations for what happened to the one U.S. fighter that has not been accounted for. He said there is no indication that it went down nor that it was hit by enemy fire. He said it could even be radio trouble. We will keep you posted on that. There are reports that the French Foreign Ministry is saying that the French embassy in Tripoli was hit by the American strike in the U.S. bombing raid tonight on Libya, which happened at about 7 o'clock Eastern time, 2 a.m. in the morning Libyan time. Secretary Weinberger said about that, first of all, he said that that would be virtually impossible, and then just a moment ago he said that that could be accurate. We will continue to keep you up to date on whether or not the French embassy there, consulate, has been hit. We saw by Secretary Weinberger showed a large map showing the route of the planes, the F-111s, and they circumvented Europe. They did not go across Europe, which obviously would have been the closest way to get from England to Tripoli to carry out the raids. When he was asked, Secretary Schultz, about whether permission had been sought and denied by France, he said that was a fair description, indicating that the U.S. had asked France to fly over and France had denied. He then said that Mrs. Thatcher had given permission for what they had planned. We now go to John Donovan, who is on the ground in Tripoli, to bring us up to date from there. John.
Couple of hours away from sunrise, so it's difficult to get a visual assessment of what's going on. We don't see any longer any fires burning. The streets have quieted down. There was a great deal of movement after the attack on the streets, vehicles rushing everywhere. We did hear sirens blowing. Apparently, those would be wounded people being taken to hospital. We don't have any confirmation on the whereabouts of Colonel Gaddafi. Libyan radio is saying that members of Gaddafi's family have been injured in the attack, which would seem to confirm that Gaddafi's compound, which is about 3 miles from here, was hit. We also understand that the former American air base here, Wheelus Field, was also hit. There are reports of various other locations being hit, but so far none of this can be confirmed by us because the Libyans are not telling us anything and we're not being allowed out of our hotel to see what's going on. We're now about 2.5 hours away from the moment that the attack began. It started with planes flying overhead, very audibly, very easy to hear. They began to rocket the city, and the Libyans then put up their defense. We recorded the sounds of the Libyan anti-aircraft guns and the aftermath of the attack. This is what it sounded like. Response tapered off, and we went into that period of just rushing about the streets, sort of general panic. People were coming out of their homes to see what was going on, and lights were going on all over the place as families were waking up, and I presume people were contacting friends and relatives to see that people were not injured. We don't have any estimate of casualties here. We have also heard the report that the French embassy was hit. Now, that embassy is not very far from where we are located, and I can report that we heard explosions quite close to our hotel, I would say within a half a mile or so, and we could see flashes within a half a mile or so. So it's conceivable to us that the neighborhood in which the French embassy was located did take at least one hit. We have no sense of what the risks are now for the Americans who are located in this country. We estimate about 1,000 American citizens live here and are working here, many of them married to Libyans, many of them also working in the oil fields, and of course there are now journalists at our hotel here. We had a bit of a fright a while back when the road leading to our hotel was blocked off and troops appeared at the front of the hotel, but we have not had any sort of friction with the Libyan people so far, or with the Libyan army. There were shortly ago 2 Libyan military officers in the lobby of our hotel very politely saying, please don't go outside, please stay inside. We're sitting in the dark, I'm afraid. The power was pulled out of our hotel as soon as the attack began, and parts of the city are now in a blackout situation. There's a partial blackout to the extent that street lights have been turned off, but we still see lights burning in some homes and windows in residential areas from where we're sitting.
John, Libyan radio is saying, as they did similarly after the Gulf of Sidra incident, that they shot down 3 U.S. planes and the pilots of all 3 planes were killed. Do you think this is the same kind of empty rhetoric we've heard before?
Well, it's hard to say. Since we're now facing the report that one of the F-111s has not been accounted for, it's difficult to say. A member of our team here, Phil Turner, did see the afterburners of some of the jets flying back out over the Mediterranean. By chance, Phil's hotel room was on the Mediterranean side of our hotel, and he could clearly see some of the jets departing the attack scene. I'd say probably about 2 or 3. We saw nothing like 18, but then the attack was over a wide area, obviously. But we just can't say whether or not Gaddafi is exaggerating his claims, and it's quite possible that he is not in any way connected with the people broadcasting from Libyan radio. We have no idea of his whereabouts. He could possibly be in a very serious condition himself.
Do you have any further information about the other targets? How about the air base and the airport? There is a distinction, I believe, in that there were 2 different targets. The former U.S. air base that is now a Libyan military air base, and then part, as I understood it, of the commercial airport was hit.
We understand that part of that airport is used for military purposes, but we have no information on whether or not it was hit tonight.
Just to bring you up to date quickly from what is being said here, and you've told us what is being said there. Libyan radio monitored in London, John reportedly is saying that the Libyans downed 3 U.S. aircraft, as our viewers just heard not long ago from Secretary of Defense Weinberger. He said that 1 U.S. jet involved in the attack has not been accounted for. That could be radio problems or any number of things, but that only 1 U.S. jet is unaccounted for, whereas Libya is saying that 3 have been downed. So there likely will be conflicting reports such as that throughout the evening, but that is what we get from the State Department. You have mentioned the fact that there were 1,000 or more Americans still there. Are they in the same community? Are they in an American section, as often happens in some cities where there are Americans working overseas, or are they scattered throughout the city? Is there any way to tell what might have become of the Americans?
In fact, they're scattered throughout the country. Some of them are on projects in the desert, some are out on oil rigs, some are involved in various businesses that put them in hotels all over Libya. So I don't have any estimate of how many are actually in this city itself, but no, there's no neighborhood or community of Americans here. There's no place really where an angry Libyan mob would concentrate its attention, except perhaps the Belgian embassy, which represents the United States here, or this hotel, because of the number of Americans who are concentrated here fulfilling their journalistic role.
John Donvan, thank you again for another live update from Tripoli. We thank you for keeping us up to date. Let's go back to Washington and Bernie and another expert who can help us have some insights into what's happened this evening. Bernie.
Thank you, Chris. The United States government tonight told the world it has an address when it comes to terrorism. The United States sent attack planes to address that situation. At one point in his address tonight, the president said, "Our evidence is direct, precise, it is irrefutable." A guest knowing something about intelligence, George Carver from the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. What do you think?
Well, I think that the president said that it was time to respond. To my view, it was way past time, because our inaction had projected the image and message that attacking Americans was riskless. That message may now be changed, but it'll take more than one strike to do it. On what you just said, though, Bernie, that's a very important point. The president was awfully specific about the kind of intelligence on which we based our action. I fear he may have been too specific, and it may be a very long time before we get similar intelligence on another terrorist depredation, because people may realize where our past information came from.
Dr. Carver, I'd like to get your thoughts on what came out in the news conference not long ago when Secretary of State Schultz said that it was a fair description when one reporter asked, was permission asked from France and denied, and is that why the U.S. planes had to circumvent Europe rather than fly over France? Tell us about that. Apparently, Margaret Thatcher of England gave her permission for whatever the U.S. wanted to do, or at least had planned. Not so from France. Your view?
We have to be a little bit careful. Margaret Thatcher must have concurred, or at least I assume she must have concurred. If not, the outrage could be, and cries could be heard over here without benefit of a radio, in U.S. warplanes taking off from British bases to attack targets in, as we know, as Libya. It would appear that they were not given permission to overfly French territory, thus, whereas the British government associated itself with the act, we can only assume or presume that the French government must have tried to put it at arm's distance.
Mr. Carver, Rick Moore.
On that point, just as Chris talked about...
Barney, go ahead.
No, you go first. Go ahead.
Okay, well, the point I was going to get to, it says on your biography here, senior fellow in future national issues. Let's talk about that a minute. The president said in his address tonight that he really didn't think this would totally do away with terrorism. What happens next? Where does the other shoe fall from? What will Gaddafi do?
Well, the president is absolutely correct, and I hope no one suffers under the delusion that this attack, long overdue, as I personally believe it may have been, is going to, quote-unquote, solve the terrorism problem, let alone the Gaddafi problem. Gaddafi is going to fight us on the turf on which he fights best. There are going to be more terrorist depredations in Europe, the Middle East, and I fear in the United States itself. He's going to challenge us, to call our bluff, as it were, to see if we have the fortitude to continue to respond and to find out if the rules of the game have been changed. In the past, they've always been played by his rules in ways advantageous to him, and it's going to take more than one action to convince him that he now has to operate under a different set of rules which inhibit him to an extent he's not been inhibited in the past.
Dr. Carver, the point that Chris Curl was making about Britain's action, France's action. On the one hand, the French denied the United States permission to make a flyover to get more directly to
we assume
Gaddafi's Libya.
We don't know that for a fact, I think, but I think that's fair presumption.
Well, we infer that from what Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger said. But in his address tonight, just about 49 minutes earlier, President Reagan said this country has received help from its allies. He mentioned that there was a planned massacre of civilians waiting in line for visas at an unnamed American embassy, and he indicated, the president said, that France had assisted Washington in getting that information. So I suppose the new government there is trying to have it both ways.
Well, no, with all due respect to the president, whom I admire greatly, he was indulging in the kind of fuzziness that politicians find so useful. I think that the French, I know for a fact, from having been in the intelligence business myself and having been responsible for 3 years for fighting terrorism in Europe, among other places, that the French have often cooperated in combating terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily associated themselves with one particular airstrike. I think they distanced themselves from tonight's raid, but have given us a lot of cooperation in the past, and the president was drawing on the former and talking about, or drawing on the latter to talk about the former.
Now, it's clear you are physically almost uneasy in your chair at the specter of the kind of refined, minute information that the president gave out. The question is motivation. Has he not been under pressure, not only from Congress, but from allies, to at least say what the evidence is? You say that they're doing this, you say they're doing that. Where's your evidence? Wasn't the president trying to placate people who say that he's not forthcoming with enough evidence?
He was, Bernie, but there, to my mind, reflecting perhaps the biases of my former profession, there are limits to which any responsible elected leader can go in placating that kind of curiosity. Because as soon as you answer one question, as you well know, your colleagues in the media are going to ask 3 more. And certain types of collection methods and techniques are terribly vulnerable to compromise. And if you are specific about particular information that you have, it's not hard for an intelligence professional to figure from where you must have gotten it or how you must have acquired it and what corrective, protective action he needs to take in the counterintelligence field. And if we're not careful, talking too much about how we have known about past terrorist attacks, even if it's awfully politically useful, is going to blind us to knowledge about future ones.
Future attacks. The United States laid the groundwork tonight to indicate its motivations. The Soviet charge d'affaires here in Washington called to the State Department and told what was going on, that the United States was acting against terrorism, that in no way was this action directed at the Soviet Union. What does this do in the Middle East, and what about the Syrian question?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir.
Well, the Soviet Union has got a fairly delicate hand to play because on the one hand, they have supported Gaddafi and have encouraged terrorism, but they don't want to get themselves too crossways with the United States. I think that we have got to anticipate reaction by Gaddafi. I think we have got to anticipate some degree of at least open verbal support from other Arab nations as they watch to see which way the wind blows. And we've got to anticipate that our resolution is going to be challenged, and people are going to see whether we're going to continue to respond to future depredations, of which I fear there will be a good number before decisions are rendered.
Can we get a little more specific about that, Dr. Carver? President Reagan said tonight that Gaddafi counted on America to be passive and that he counted wrong. An American was killed, numerous Americans injured in Berlin. That's the only incident we have, as far as we understand it at this point, direct facts, according to the White House, linking Gaddafi with that incident of terrorism. If indeed, as you've implied, there are other acts of terrorism, what do we do next? How far do we go? How big a stick do we carry into Libya to ultimately stop?
Well, we have to be prepared, I think, to respond and to try very hard in each case to make our response proportionate and directed against the person who's guilty of that particular offense. Unfortunately, you're not always going to be able to do that. In the past, one thing that has inhibited us has been, to my mind, an unrealistic standard of proof that has to be met. We've had to know precisely who was guilty of that particular act. We've had to be able to prove it. We've had to have hard evidence. We've had to be surgical, etc., etc. That is not the real world. And that has caused us to be inactive so long that, as I was saying earlier, we've conveyed the message by inaction that attacking Americans is riskless. That is a message we have got to change unless we want more American lives to be sacrificed on that particular altar.
What will Syria do?
Syria will consult its interest very carefully, will move with some circumspection, will try not to give us a clear-cut instance of Syrian complicity to which we can respond, but I think the Syrians will try to encourage Arab solidarity and enhance Hafiz Assad, will attempt to enhance his own place in the Arab community by sponsoring ambiguous acts of terrorism in Lebanon and elsewhere to see how far we are prepared to go against them as well as against the Libyans.
It was interesting as we've been bringing in reports from Britain and from elsewhere in Europe, and then we've also heard the TASS reported tonight only that it occurred. There was a report from Washington, and then there was a report that had a dateline from Tripoli. Not the condemnation that often occurs against any action by the U.S. in situations such as this. Tell us what you think of that. The fact that TASS is reporting that it happened, that it has moved some of its military equipment out of the way and has sort of backed off this past week from aligning itself militarily with Libya to combat the United States, should there have been any other confrontation, which there has been. How do you see this at the moment and also down the road a bit?
Well, at the moment it's a trifle obscure, and down the road it's even murkier, but I'm sure there's been a great deal of private dialogue going on where we have explained to the Russians that we will keep them apprised, but we will regard public association of themselves with the Libyan cause as an unfriendly act. And I think that to some extent their acquiescence in a public posture that we want has been the price of informing them of what we plan to do so they can protect their own citizens. The Russians would like to support Gaddafi but do not want a major crisis with the United States at this time, and that means that they have a fairly narrow channel through which they have to steer. I think they're going to see how much discretionary latitude they've got. I think they would like to distance themselves from us and put us in a maximally awkward spot, but I think they also are going to have to decide how firm our resolve is going to be and whether the past ground rules, which have given them an awful lot of diplomatic latitude, have now changed.
George Carver, we've picked your brain so many times, I'm going to be considerate of you. If you want to go ahead and cough, you might have a little frog in your throat. Please feel free to, or take a sip of water.
Just take a quick sip.
Okay, as you're doing that, I'd like to put this question to you. We know that Muammar Gaddafi is not fully the master of his own house. Is a secondary thought on the part of the United States that perhaps this attack might internally be the beginning of the end of Gaddafi?
Well, if there's any such thought, Bernie, I hope it's not taken too seriously. That's a splendid hope, but only a hope, not something that you could realistically anticipate. The best way, my own mind, again reflecting the biases of my former profession, to have handled Gaddafi was not with the Sixth Fleet, but with the right kind of covert action program, not with the U.S. doing it itself, but encouraging those other members of the Libyan military who might have thought that it was in their and Libya's best interest for him to be replaced. Unfortunately, the U.S. government at the present time can't engage in covert action. There was a plan last fall of some unspecified nature, approved by the oversight committees of both the House and the Senate, the intelligence oversight committees, and it was promptly spoiled by someone who didn't approve of it by being leaked to the Washington Post, which splashed it all over the front page of a Sunday edition. So long as we have that kind of media attitude and that kind of leakiness in Congress, we will not have the option of covert action to deal with a threat like Gaddafi, and will, I fear, have to use something like the Sixth Fleet.
Well, as we know, there's a lot going on, and you've walked and worked in the murky world, the lonely world of intelligence gathering. And as you contemplate this in the final seconds we have before we have to thank you for being with us, how should Americans be watching what's happening right now? What should we key on?
With great concern, but what they ought to key on is the next move in the chess game. The next move of the chess game is bound to come, and we will not like it, and we have to be prepared to respond to it.
Okay, Dr. Carver, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise on this breaking story this evening. And our live coverage of the story will continue throughout the night here on CNN. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Leona, your automatic teller. Can I help you with a student loan?
No, a car loan, Leona. Fast forward.
A home improvement loan.
Aye. It's a General Motors car.
Don't get hassled when you finance a new car or truck. Get GMAC financing only at your GM dealer.
Is there someone live I could talk with around
Do we
here?
have one of our calendars? This is a farm calendar. We also have what they call a printing calendar. If I can only find it.
Before you get a costly tune-up, help fix your rough-running engine with Gum Out. Jet Spray Gum Out on your carburetor dissolves dirt and grime to help fight hard starts and stalling. And just as this cleans the outside, Gum Out Carburetor and Fuel Injector Cleaner will clean inside your carburetor or fuel injectors and remove moisture. Smart Auto advice is Jet Spray Gum Out for the outside, Gum Out Liquid for the inside. Gum Out, the between tune-ups tune-up.
It's paving season again, and your Fuller O'Brien dealer has the best prices of the season on our better quality paints. Save on foolproof latex flat wall paint, just $9.99 a gallon. Fuller Glow latex satin enamel, only $11.99 a gallon. And full stain flat latex house paint, now $10.99 a gallon. Pick up a brush and get the best prices of the season at your Fuller O'Brien Pro Shop. If it's worth painting, it's worth Fuller O'Brien. Simply the best.
It's no secret. The last 20 years have been hard on the manufacturing industry. But in Ohio, instead of clinging to the past, we're building to meet the future head on. With state matching funds, university research combines practical technology with basic manufacturing to help new firms innovate and mature firms revitalize. Call 1-800-345-OHIO for your free Ohio resource packet and find out how Ohio can help your business grow.
We have a couple of late-breaking items to bring to you now. Our reporter in Tripoli, John Donovan, has apparently, as he's reported to us, been summoned along with other reporters to the lobby of the hotel where he and other journalists are staying and have been reporting from in Tripoli. They were told to bring with them their cameras. We can only assume that they will be recording something for us, and as soon as we find out what it is and what has been told to them in the lobby of their hotel in Tripoli, we will repeat it to you. Also, the brother of the American soldier who was killed in the bombing of the West Berlin club, for which this strike, the president says, is retaliation, said today that U.S. military retaliation against Libya was long overdue. Speaking from Detroit, Robin Beecham said, "I think we did the right thing. The president did what he had to do. I think it's long overdue. I don't think they bombed, however, just because of my brother." And we will be continuing to bring you the latest in this story throughout the evening here on CNN. President Reagan says that the U.S. has direct evidence that Libya was responsible for that terrorist bombing of the nightclub in West Berlin. And the administration suspects, but so far has said that there is as yet no hard evidence that Gaddafi was involved in other attacks that involved American victims. We have a report now from CNN's Don Lennox.
On April 5th in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel. This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime.
While the United States is using the recent bombing of a discotheque in West Germany as reason for its attack against Libya, several other terrorist acts against the United States may have been involved. Most notably, attacks against civilians at airports in Rome and Vienna last December. It was just 2 days after Christmas when terrorists carried out attacks in the crowded airport terminals. 20 people were killed, 110 others wounded. Among the dead were 5 Americans. 4 of the terrorists were also killed. The group claiming responsibility for the action was the Fatah Revolutionary Council, but Libya was suspected. In November, terrorists hijacked an Egypt Air jetliner and forced it to land in Malta. An American passenger was killed by the terrorists. Shortly thereafter, Egyptian forces stormed the plane. 57 passengers and the 2 hijackers died in the fusillade of bullets. 3 groups claim responsibility, including Abu Nidal's Arab Revolutionary Command, which allegedly receives financial support from the Gaddafi regime. And in October of 1985, the Italian cruise liner Achille Lauro was seized by 4 Palestinians as it sailed the Mediterranean. American Leon Klinghoffer was shot and his body dumped overboard. The terrorists who seized the ship were captured and remain in the custody of Italian authorities. The Palestinian Liberation Front says it was behind the action. Suspected backers of that organization are Tunisia, Syria, and Libya. While the administration has not revealed hard evidence linking Libya directly to these and other terrorist acts, the administration has indicated time and again it has proof that Gaddafi either orchestrated or paid for them. Monday night, the Reagan administration said it had enough proof to link Gaddafi directly with the bombing in West Germany that left an American soldier dead.
Libya bears direct responsibility for the bombing in West Berlin on April 5th that resulted in the death of Army Sergeant Kenneth Ford and injury to a number of American servicemen and others. In light of this reprehensible act of violence and clear evidence that Libya is planning future attacks, the United States has chosen to exercise its right of self-defense.
It was that proof, the administration says, that led to its decision to retaliate against Gaddafi. Don Lennox, CNN.
We have done what we've had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again, is how the president described United States resolve in this crisis. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Charles Bierbauer. Charles is not aware we're having audio difficulties with him over at the White House. Of course, we're scrambling to clear that up right away. One of the things that was interesting in terms of what was done, what kind of armament was used, were the remarks, the information passed on by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. Before we report that, as you heard it, but before we go back over that, let's go back to the White House and Charles Bierbauer. Charles, we missed you at the top of your report, so we come back to you.
Ernie, if you can hear me now, it seems that what the president has ordered in the attack against Libyan bases, and particularly the terrorist bases within Libya, is both a punitive and a preemptive strike. It is punitive in the sense that the president said that the evidence is direct, precise, irrefutable, that the Libyans were behind that disco bombing in Berlin in which 1 American was killed. It is preemptive in the sense that the president said that other attacks were planned by the Libyans. In fact, Secretary of State George Shultz said that 30 American embassies had been targeted by Libya. At the same time, the president has been so often criticized for inaction that he seemed somewhat defensive about it and took careful note to say that some people feel the proper way to deal with Mr. Gaddafi is to ignore him. Said the president, I do not agree. Even as we're speaking there, you may be able to hear, Bernie, there's a small demonstration across the street from the White House. They've been chanting, hands off Libya. This is sure to be a controversial thing. We heard today the president say and express gratitude to America's friends and allies in helping carry out this strike. But indeed, what we heard subsequently from Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger is that Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher gave a go-ahead for American planes to take off from Britain, the F-111s that took part in the bombing raids, but that France refused overflight permission, requiring those American pilots leaving from Britain to fly a roundabout 2,800 nautical mile trek to get around France and Spain and across the Mediterranean to Libya. So there is not full agreement on how this thing has been handled by the Reagan administration. Several other key points. Secretary Weinberger did say that so far one of those F-111 planes has not been accounted for. They won't be due back at their bases in Britain until 2 a.m. our time, so it may be some time until we learn whether there are any American casualties. All the Navy planes from the two carriers are accounted for. Another key point, Secretary of State George Shultz said that the Soviets were called in this evening. The charge at the mission here was told why the U.S. is doing what it is doing, what the evidence is, and that the direct target of American action was Libya and not the Soviet Union. And finally, the president said that there are no illusions, that this will bring an end to terrorism, that it would bring down the Gaddafi regime. But in Secretary Shultz's words, it is not a matter of settling a score, but in raising the cost to the point that perhaps it will have some deterrent effect on Mr. Gaddafi and he will stop his terrorist acts. Bernie?
Thank you, Charles. Now let's very quickly go over to the State Department and Foreign Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter.
Bernie, I think the indication of how extensive is the disagreement among the NATO allies over this action comes from the fact that, as Charles pointed out, the American planes had to fly nearly twice as far as they otherwise might have if France and Spain had granted overflight permission. The only ally that appears to have been strongly behind the American mission is Great Britain, and President Reagan certainly will owe a debt of gratitude to Prime Minister Thatcher when he meets her in just a couple of weeks in Tokyo at the Economic Summit. In addition, some of the allies, we understand, were not even informed in advance of this mission, again illustrating the depth of the dissension within the NATO alliance over how to handle this. Secretary Shultz came close to strongly criticizing the NATO allies this evening when he indicated that the economic community, the European economic community, did not go far enough in its sanctions announced today to ban the sale of weapons to Libya and to somewhat restrict the movements of Libyan diplomats in Europe. So President Reagan will certainly have to deal with a dissensive alliance when he goes to Tokyo in a couple of weeks. Whether or not he will consider that a detriment to the long-term planning of anti-terrorism by the United States remains to be seen. The allies themselves, in some cases, are privately agreeing that the president should have gone ahead and done what he did, but they have to make it clear that they wanted no part of it. Spain and France obviously did make that clear by refusing permission for the American planes to fly over. The other allies as well will certainly come out and say they had no part in the planning and perhaps even were glad that they were not notified in advance. Now for more details on the military aspects of the mission, including the length of the flight, the planes that were used, and the targets that were hit, CNN military correspondent Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon.
Well, Ralph, the mission went off with only one hitch, it appears, and that is the loss of one F-111. There's only one plane. They haven't confirmed that it's lost yet, but Defense Secretary Weinberger said one has not been accounted for. There were approximately 33, 18 of them F-111s flying out of England, and roughly 18 A-6s and A-7s flying off of the carriers in the area. They hit their targets. They all are on their way back. The F-111s should be returning to their bases by around 2 o'clock Eastern Time. We may get a handle then on what happened to the one plane that is missing. The fact that the airplanes that are in the air now do not know where it is leads to some speculation. But Defense Secretary Weinberger said he could not confirm that it was shot down. He said perhaps there was something internal, like perhaps it had lost communications or perhaps it had an explosion or fire in the aircraft itself. But that does not mean that the crew is lost. There is a two-person crew on board. There is a pilot and a radar weapon system operator who fly the mission. They are unaccounted for at the present time. The published range of the F-111 is roughly 3,100 nautical miles, and that's if it's using external tanks, which it probably was not, since there were refueling planes in the area. So probably it would fly 1,500 miles without having to be refueled. That is one of the unknown cards out of this operation, one that we will find out later on. How this mission is going to be read on Capitol Hill is one of the ongoing questions, and for perhaps some indication of how that's going, let's go to Linda Tyra now on Capitol Hill.
Leaders of the U.S. House and Senate were braced for the attack, but they kept grim-faced and silent until the White House broke the news tonight. A group of congressional leaders was summoned to the White House in advance and told this afternoon at 4 p.m., just 3 hours before the military strike took place. Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole said tonight the mood among those at the White House meeting was supportive of the president, although he recalled that a couple of members of Congress said that they wanted to reserve judgment on the matter. A central question is, did the president comply with the War Powers Act, improperly notifying Congress of what it was doing?
Yes, to my satisfaction. It may not be to everyone's satisfaction, but as Mr. Poindexter, the president's NSC chief, National Security Council chief, pointed out, the reason for the consultation at least 2 or 3 hours ahead of the strike was in the event there was a strong feeling by congressional representatives, there would still be time to call it off.
I think it's quite clear that we were not consulted with. We were called down to the White House at 4 o'clock, be there at 4 o'clock, and we were there. The action began at 7 o'clock, 3 hours later, or a few minutes thereafter. So as I said there, the decision's already made. Obviously, this is not consultation. The decision is made, and you've called us down here to tell us about your decision.
So there is obvious conflict and dispute among congressional leaders as to whether the administration properly notified Congress. However, Senator Byrd stopped short of saying the administration violated the War Powers Act. He noted that there are some instances where secrecy is of the utmost importance, and that perhaps this was one of those instances. In addition, there seems to be another point of contention. Senator Dole and Senator Strom Thurmond, both at the meeting, say they believe the administration indicated it would have called off the strike if there had been strong congressional feeling against it. But no such opposition was expressed, according to Senators Dole and Thurmond. Senator Byrd, on the other hand, says he thinks there was no changing the administration's game plan, and that this meeting was called merely to go through the motions of notifying members of both the House and the Senate leadership. Meanwhile, Senator Dole says there is no question in his mind that the American public will rally behind the president and give him what he called resounding support. Linda Tyra reporting live from Capitol Hill.
Thank you, Linda, and to the other correspondents. And now a look at the reason we're reporting on this story tonight. The man behind the story, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. To many people in the Arab world, he is a hero. To President Reagan, he's the mad dog of the Middle East. CNN's Mark Leff profiles Colonel Gaddafi.
The picture many Westerners have of Muammar Gaddafi is of a mercurial, raving fanatic dedicated to fomenting revolution, calling for attacks on American targets around the world. But there's another side to Libya's 44-year-old leader, a side he displayed or portrayed in a West German magazine. In it, he describes his passions as horseback riding, hunting, and writing, and he admits to crying from time to time when he's alone. Despite his anti-Western position, Gaddafi describes himself as a lover of classical music, especially Beethoven, and an admirer of American author Harriet Beecher Stowe. A devout Muslim who's often photographed at prayer when he travels, Gaddafi tells the magazine one wife is enough instead of the 4 Islamic law allows. He lives for the most part alone in a tent, while his wife and 7 children live in a house in Tripoli. Is the West German portrait the real Gaddafi? People who know him and know Libya say no.
He is a zealot, a terrorist, and a revolutionary, and it doesn't make any difference whether he reads Uncle Tom's Cabin or listens to Beethoven.
Gaddafi's well-publicized claims to the Gulf of Sidra prompted last month's military confrontation with the U.S. Navy and cost several Libyan lives. A line from the West German magazine interview may shed some light on his motives. Gaddafi told the reporter he has no fear of death, but does fear nuclear weapons. Gaddafi told the magazine he wrote 2 short stories for himself last year, the titles Flight to Hell and death. Mark Leff, CNN.
Now, to shed some light on this entire episode and what has led up to it, Dr. Ken Stein, who is a professor at the Emory University here in Atlanta, joins us. He's a Middle Eastern expert.
Dr. Stein, give us your impression of what has happened. The President and his men, Secretary of Defense Weinberger and Secretary of State Schultz, all have characterized it as a preemptive strike, although in retaliation for one particular terrorist act and others as well. How do you see it, how it was carried out, and what the effect of it is?
Well, I think Charles Beerbarrow said it right. I think he said it was punitive as well as preemptive. This was a calculated, measured response by the U.S. administration 9 to 11 days after the Berlin episode. If we take a look at what the Reagan administration has done against terrorism, we see that when the Achille Lauro was hijacked, we intercepted that airliner and brought those Palestinians down on a NATO base in Sicily. When we had our run-in with Mr. Gaddafi previously in March, we went into the Gulf of Sidra and we calculated, measured, and calibrated our response against military targets. This again was a precise military exercise in which we used F-111s from Great Britain, flew them 2,800 miles one way, in a demonstration again of our power, our ability to project power over a long distance. But we waited, we consulted, we took our time, we didn't do anything precipitous, we didn't go in and get civilian sites. We were very careful. And it'll be very difficult for the Arab world to paint Ronald Reagan as the John Wayne Hollywood type who goes in with a 6-gun, indiscriminately kills people. I think the message was sent to Mr. Gaddafi this time and to those people who support international terrorism that a democracy is setting a precedent that will use its power, if necessary, to defend the rights of civilians to travel and to be abroad.
But is there a parallel here, Dr. Stein? Israel has had to deal with terrorism over the years, much before the United States had to begin to deal with terrorism. And Israel has always said no negotiations with terrorists and as swift retribution and all the things that we are now hearing from President Reagan. And yet it's still not over for Israel either. What parallels, if any, do you draw?
Well, the parallels were, I think, that the United States picked out very precise targets in Libya, as the Israelis have done in the past in trying to eradicate or remove logistical training support bases for terrorists elsewhere in the Middle East. I think the second point, the Israelis have never negotiated with terrorists, and I think Mr. Gaddafi realizes that Mr. Reagan wasn't going to negotiate with him. It's very important, I think, to know that Ronald Reagan, in this particular episode, made a gesture to the Libyan people tonight saying, we're not against Libyan people, we're against your leader, Mr. Gaddafi, who is taking you down the wrong road, a road of lawlessness that we won't tolerate. And that is very similar, I think, to the attitude that the Israelis have taken over the years against terrorism as well.
Dr. Stein, to follow through on that, what does Gaddafi do next? What do we do next? President Reagan, in that address you mentioned tonight, said that he was not unrealistic enough to think that this attack would do away with terrorism. And we've had other experts on tonight who expect Gaddafi to come back with some other attack somewhere. Then what?
Well, you cannot eradicate world terrorism. What we have identified is that Mr. Gaddafi is an address. He's one of many addresses for world terrorism. There could be 15 or 20 groups that could have been responsible for that bombing in that TWA 840 flight over Greece. But we have found irrefutable evidence tying Gaddafi to this particular episode, which has got to drive home the point to people engaged in terrorism, particularly state-supported terrorism, that this will not be tolerated by the United States. And that's a very important lesson. Now, whether Gaddafi does something after tomorrow, whether he rallies support internally, whether he's able to create another terrorist incident in Europe, then the United States, apparently from what we've done in the past, will again turn up the decibels one level higher. But we don't know when that will be or what that level will be.
There are terrorists in several countries in the Middle East, and I'm wondering if this episode could pull all of these people in these countries together. Syria has indicated that before this happened that they would support Libya if it did.
What we have seen in the past, when terrorist acts have taken place and the United States has responded or Israel has responded, we have seen Arab countries uniformly bind themselves together in support of an Arab brother. A high-ranking Egyptian official told me in February when I was in Cairo, he said, if you ask 100 Egyptians who they are, they will say they're Egyptians. But if you ask those same 100 Egyptians who they are the day after you attack Gaddafi, they will say they are Arabs. But then ask them the day after that, and they'll go back to saying that they're Egyptians. And I think that is, in fact, what will happen. There will be unanimity in support of Gaddafi for a period of time, maybe a week, maybe 3, 4, 5 days, and then most likely editorials in the Arab world will begin talking about military disengagement from the Eastern Mediterranean. But many of these countries do not particularly like Gaddafi meddling in their affairs, as he has in Chad, Tunisia, Egypt, the Sudan, and other countries in the Middle East.
Where would the split be? Syria, one would expect, would continue as it always has been as a sometime ally, probably more hardcore than the others. Saudi Arabia seems to have closer ties to the United States, at least economically. Is there a split, and if there is one, where does it fall?
Well, the Arab world is in great general disarray now anyway, and one of the major reasons is the Iran-Iraq war. It is very indicative to point out that when the Arab League met the last time we had our confrontation with Libya in mid-March, the Arab League did not vote to issue economic sanctions against the United States. And the Iraqis particularly didn't want to issue any sanction against the United States because the Iraqis don't like the Libyans. The Libyans are supporting Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. So that war itself has created great division and great disarray. I think much of the Arab world would like to see a general change or political change take place in Libya that does not adversely affect their relations with the United States over the long run, because they have very positive needs for a relationship with the United States.
Dr. Stein, again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us, as you have on previous occasions. Dr. Ken Stein, a Mideast expert with Emory University here in Atlanta. Chris?
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Ken. As Secretary of Defense Weinberger told viewers and reporters earlier this evening, many of the F-111s which flew the airstrike against Libya tonight flew from U.S. bases in England. There is reaction from around the world tonight to the U.S. strikes against Libya. We turn now to Richard Blystone, who is with us now with a live update from London. Richard.
Good morning. It's about 4:30 in the morning here in Britain, and no information to us as yet of the return of the F-111s, which took part in the strike from 2 bases in Britain. The morning papers still aren't out. The early editions have been taken back for retooling. The front pages will now reflect the fact to the Britons that their government helped the United States in this very controversial strike. And I don't think it's too early to predict that the reaction here from the political opposition and in Europe from other American allies will be strong and in many cases angry. We will not have any report from the British government for another 4 hours. Earlier today, there was a great deal of activity among the F-111s based at Lakenheath in northeast England and in Upper Hayford to the northwest of London. It was just an exercise, the Air Force said, but a few hours later it turned into something serious. There are 150 of the swing-wing jets based at those 2 bases in England, and they're supposed to be permanently ready in any case as part of the air arm of NATO. Tonight they launched in another direction in that big southward hook to Libya. The Air Force did acknowledge earlier what British hobbyist airplane spotters had reported, that there were an unusually large number of tanker aircraft which had come into Britain over the weekend. We now know what they came for. Britain was one of the leaders of the meeting of Economic Community foreign ministers in The Hague earlier today. Sir Geoffrey Howe, the foreign minister, was trying to persuade the 12 allies that they should do what Britain has done against Libya. That is to break off diplomatic relations, as Britain did 2 years ago after a siege at the Libyan People's Bureau, its diplomatic mission, and to close the mission and to cut down on the movements of Libyans in Britain and stop military sales. They didn't get quite that. They did get a condemnation of Libya, linking it with terrorism, and an undertaking to cut down on the numbers of these Libyan diplomats. But the Europeans have been very wary about other action. The Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi has called the situation a tangle of problems that can't be solved by a military blitz. And the Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl, has warned the United States that if you get into something, you'd better have an idea how you're going to get out of it.
Richard Blystone, I'm going to interrupt you, but I know you're not going anywhere right away, so thank you for that update so far, live from London, and we'll be getting back with you shortly. Right now, we want to go back to Tripoli, Libya, and John Donovan, where he has new developments to report there. John.
The fighting has started all over again. About 5 minutes ago, the sky was lit up once again with anti-aircraft fire. I don't know if you can hear the explosions, but they're going on almost non-stop. There are flashes all over the sky. Apparently, the Libyans think that American planes have returned or are returning because it's again a barrage aimed at the sky. We do not hear any aircraft, but the Libyans seem to think that there is something up there. We also have just spoken with a businessman who thought he saw firing coming in towards Libya from the Mediterranean. We were about to be taken out of the hotel by the Libyans to be shown some of the damage. They tell us that the French embassy was not hit, as earlier reported, but that an apartment building across the street had collapsed after a shell apparently had hit it, with heavy civilian loss of life, heavy civilian casualties, and they were taking us out to show us that. As we were in the lobby about to board a bus, and by the way, there are now plenty of guns in the lobby here, there was suddenly a panic ensuing. Flares appeared over the Mediterranean, and gunfire erupted. A major panic ensued in the lobby. Libyans came running off the street, pouring into the lobby and knocking over the press corps that was on its way out, screaming at everyone to turn off every light. It's dark enough already in this hotel, but many of us had flashlights or candles, and the Libyans were literally jumping on people who still had lights, telling them to put them out, for fear that an attack was about to begin. Now, the barrage that I was describing a minute ago that suddenly lit up the sky appears to have calmed down yet again. There are occasional flashes, but a few minutes ago, the whole city, once again, was like the 4th of July.
John, is there any indication that there is incoming, or does it seem to be mostly outgoing? I ask because more than 4 hours ago, White House spokesman Larry Speakes was saying that all the American planes either had returned to their base or were en route to their base, with the exception of one unaccounted for F-111, and that as far as they were reporting, it was over. Does it seem to be over? Is it a one-way fire or incoming fire?
I have to say, it's difficult, very difficult to gauge, but it seems as though the Libyans were reacting to something they thought was real, and we have spoken to witnesses who believe they saw incoming coming from the direction of the Mediterranean. Also, some of the anti-aircraft defense was apparently coming from the area of the airport. It has started again. I don't know if you can hear it.
Yes, John, we can. John, is there any possibility that this could be shelling or missile activity from our fleet in the Mediterranean shooting toward Tripoli?
Of course it's possible. And since we don't hear any aircraft, and since the Libyans seem to be reacting to something, I think that Navy activity would be the most likely candidate. The explosions you may be hearing are still Libyan guns firing into the sky, anti-aircraft, and from time to time we can see the tracer bullets. But it definitely seems like we're going into another round here. The Libyans seem to think it was all over. They were going to take us out on the streets, and they don't want us to get hurt because I think they want us to show us the pictures that they plan to take us to see. And they would not have taken us out of here if they didn't think that the thing was over. But a major surprise to them, and panic ensued when the shooting started again.
Is there any evidence you've seen from your perspective, and I realize that it's limited until they take you somewhere or let you out to observe yourself, but what do you see and hear in the streets? Are there any civilians out? Are there any ambulances visible? You said earlier that they honk their horns. There aren't actual sirens as we're used to. But what other than military activity do you see or hear in the streets?
After we spoke before, we did hear a few sirens. I don't know if they belong to ambulances. And during the lull between the last round of firing and this one, there were civilians out on the street, as though people came out after a rainstorm to smell the flowers. There were people coming out more or less as sightseers, and they all went back to bed and turned off their lights. The city now, in fact, is very dark. The lights in the port have been turned off at last, and it looks as though all official publicly controlled lighting, such as street lights, has been turned off. We still see some lamps burning in people's homes in the residential areas here. There are no more civilians on the street. To answer your question, most simply, I would think that the only vehicles out there now belong to military personnel.
John, this is Bernie in Washington. I'm not letting my reading of military history and novels get the better part of me, and there's no way of knowing. You indicated the Libyans appear to be firing at something. They might not know what they're firing at. I'm just wondering, and I don't expect you to have an answer to this, but I'm just wondering, since American officials here in Washington have told us that one F-111 is unaccounted for, I'm just wondering whether our forces off the Gulf of Sidra are firing to protect a possibly downed American pilot. Just a thought.
There is every possibility of that, Bernie. Now, Phil Turner, our sound man, saw some of the jets in the earlier attack returning over the Mediterranean just in front of our hotel, and that is now basically the same zone from which we think some of the firing from the sea is coming from. It's possible, as you say, that this could be cover for a rescue operation. But as we must always say here, we can't confirm that. It's too dark. No one's telling us very much.
Well, I know we can't confirm it, but if indeed an American is down there and we know it and the ships are firing, giving him protective cover, and possibly, if it's true, allowing our people to reach to him, let's hope they get him. Chris, Rick?
Okay, John, I would like to follow up, if we could, on your conversation earlier. You said that the Libyan officials were about to take you out and show you damage. Did they make any comment? I know you haven't gone because of this attack or would-be attack, but did they make any comment about Colonel Gaddafi, about his family, about any injuries or number of casualties?
They are saying that his compound was hit, and they are talking still about casualties among members of his family, but nothing about Gaddafi himself. We're also getting some suggestions, again, I have to say it's unconfirmed, that Soviet personnel at the compound may also have been injured in the attack. Libyan radio referred to foreigners being wounded, and there is some thought here that this might refer to Soviet advisors who were temporarily staying at the compound. The compound, by the way, accommodates a lot of people. It's not just the residential headquarters of Gaddafi himself, but some of his close aides, and there is plenty of room for guests there. We hear some shouting on the streets now, and I don't know what that is. We've heard that from time to time, but we hear a man with a very strident voice shouting. I think he may be telling people to get back in their houses, and it may be that he's shouting at people to turn off their lights because there are still a few lights burning. We can finally see the stars in this city. It's that dark here now that the sky is very brightly lit just by starlight, and by the flashes that are now starting again. We're seeing some very major lights flashing right by our window. An explosion a few blocks away, and a major new round of firing. This looks like the terrain in the World War I picture, with flashes on the horizon setting off silhouettes of buildings and anti-aircraft fire mingling with the starlight. If it weren't so horrible, it would be beautiful.
Are there soldiers in the hotel with you now?
I wouldn't call them soldiers, but they are armed men in civilian clothes, apparently attached to the revolutionary committees. They are very nervous and not particularly friendly to us. I would say that the Ministry of Information officials who are normally attached to us and who are with us now are maintaining an even demeanor towards us, and we haven't heard a single remark like, how could your nation do this? Nothing like that. It was more like, we want to show you what's been done. We don't feel any kind of a threat from the Ministry of Information officials, and in fact no overt threat whatsoever. But clearly there's going to be some anger, and I think we saw the first indications of that in the grim faces of these armed young men now standing in our hotel lobby.
Well, if they didn't want you to be reporting to us tonight, John Donvan, they would have cut the telephone lines. So
that's certainly true.
We assume that we will continue to be able to hear your reports. Rick has a question for you now.
Yeah, John, those blasts going off sound very close. How close to you would you say they are? And if you do get another one, while we still have you on the air, let us listen.
Well, the last one you heard, I think, was perhaps about 4 or 5 blocks away from here. Frankly, I'm kneeling in a crouched position on my hotel balcony so that I can see what's going on and try to get as much cover as possible. but again, because of the darkness, and we're rather hemmed in by a line of buildings around us, I can't see over beyond the next couple of streets. That last blast, though, that you heard came distinctly from the area where the Belgian embassy is located, and that's the embassy representing American interests, and several other embassies. I don't mean to imply that the Belgian embassy has been hit, but there has been an explosion from that region, and that is about the closest one we've seen so far. Again now, we seem to be in something of a lull. It's difficult to understand why this fire seems to come in sudden bursts. The whole city, the entire horizon will light up for a period of a minute, and then the whole city will go dark again. Obviously, there's some sort of a central command operating here, giving orders to batteries all around the city to open fire and cease fire. We don't know what sort of information they're working off of, but apparently they're watching their radar, and they have some reason to believe that they should be firing their guns, because this is a serious barrage. I by no means think this is a show for us. The reaction of the Libyans in the lobby when the shooting began, which was fear and panic and near hysteria, certainly didn't indicate that this is any kind of a rehearsal. This is real combat.
Are you able to hear any of the reports on the radio, or hear what is the latest that the Libyan radio is putting out? I would assume for civilian consumption, or for perhaps for foreign consumption.
Nothing yet. All of the broadcasts have been in Arabic, and mine is a little rusty to be picking up exactly what they're saying. But I think that the situation has changing so quickly that the Libyans are not in a position to be apprising their people of the situation. Again, I hit this point. They were so sure that this thing was over and relaxed and calm about it, though angry, that a bus was literally pulling up with its parking lights on in front of the hotel to take us away when this eruption occurred.
John, just a quick observation before a question. All of us here back in the United States appreciate what you and the other CNN staff members are doing over there, and we hope you'll remain safe. If you get an opportunity to ask him a question, what do you think your first question would be of Muammar Gaddafi?
That's something we sit and think about all of the time, because usually when you get to see the man, it's one question, and usually the answer is so oblique that it often is difficult to understand, and you're often not sure where to go with it. So you have to phrase the question in a very careful way, and in a way that won't turn him off. I think the question I would like to put to him is, in all of this, do you think Libya has risked and lost or gained more, or has the United States risked or lost or gained more? And I think a question like that would probably have a fairly predictable answer, but the vociferousness with which he answered it might give some indication of whether he thinks he's made some mistakes or not.
John Donovan, you said you're in your room on the balcony. Tell us about other Westerners, other Americans in the hotel. Is that a hotel that is specifically, as happens in some Middle Eastern countries, specifically set up for Western reporters or for foreign reporters, so that they can have phone lines and access to communications and that sort of thing?
Not necessarily. It is Libya's best and only really serviceable hotel by Western standards. The only hotel that has reliable telephone service and telex lines. So a lot of people use it, not just journalists. And everybody's come out of their rooms, and I've been hearing what's happening on the other side of the hotel from some European businessmen who are dropping in our room to see what we're hearing from Washington about what's going on. We all stood around here, the European businessmen and ourselves, and listened to President Reagan's speech. And the European reaction, limited though it may be here, was somewhat skeptical about the president's reasons for undertaking this action. But then the European reaction often is different and skeptical of Washington's motives. There are probably about 80 foreign journalists here. I would say about 40 of those are American, and most of them are probably in the same position I am now on their respective balconies, hunkered down and watching this. I can't give you any kind of an idea of what's happening to Americans outside of this hotel. They are dispersed all over the country. Many of them are probably in Libyan households because they are spouses of Libyans and their children are Libyan, and I would imagine that they feel themselves in a particularly difficult position. There are also non-attached Americans who have come in here for business reasons on long-term arrangements to contribute their expertise to work in oil rigs or construction, architecture, design, that sort of thing. They are everywhere dispersed, numbering probably about 800, and there's no telling what their situation is now, whether they are among Libyans who are sympathetic and friendly or whether the atmosphere around them has suddenly turned hostile. Towards us, I can't say it has turned overtly hostile. Just, I would say it's become a lot more serious.
Okay, John, thank you. We're going to give you a short break as we continue our coverage of this unusual news story that is consuming all of our time, and we'll be live throughout the evening here on CNN.
And that is the U.S. strikes against Libya tonight. We'll be right back.
No, Mr. 25 in red.
Only Canon's 3525 lets you change colors.
Not the grapes in red, just the apples.
And copy in 2 colors at once.
Oh, forget the grapes. Just give me more apples.
Canon's dual color copier with a singular difference.
As a mother and now a grandmother, I want to feel comfortable and sure about the medicines I put in my medicine cabinet. That's why when it came to choosing a pain reliever, I chose Tylenol. They gave me Tylenol when I spent a few days in the hospital. And I'm staying with it. Only now I'm using Tylenol caplets. They work just as well as the capsules did. But because they're specially coated and shaped, I find them even easier to swallow.
Easy to swallow extra strength caplets from Tylenol.
In sports, nobody's perfect. You drop one here, you miss one there. But CNN has one sports team you can count on. Catch Sports Tonight, every night at 11:30 p.m. Eastern on CNN.
Crystal Dark for juices. Crystal Dark on the rocks. Crystal Dark for strawberries. Crystal Dark for champagne. Crystal Dark for jelly beans or for when you're thirsty. Whatever you put in it, Crystal Dark is for beauty. And best of all, it's surprisingly affordable. Crystal Dark, French lead crystal.
If you could see through walls, you could see termites. But normally you won't see termites until it's too late, often thousands of dollars too late. You need America's #1 choice, Orkin.
Orkin.
Now with a total repair guarantee that says if termites damage your home after treatment, we'll repair it, whatever the cost. No wonder people choose Orkin far more than any other company.
Orkin. Call the Orkin Army, #1 against pests.
Your network of record is continuing its extensive live coverage of the United States retaliation against terrorism, tonight attacking Libya. Our men of Crossfire, Tom Braden, Robert Novak, are here with some more thoughts. Gentlemen?
Bob, we've witnessed our first battle in the war against terrorism, and I guess it was successful. But state terrorism, we can't hit it in Lebanon. There is no state. We possibly would be dangerous to hit it in Syria because it's pretty close to the Soviet Union. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we've got to worry about Libya, Tom. I don't think it's our first battle. We hit them in the Mediterranean Sea. They hit the disco in Berlin. And I think that Secretary of State Schultz and President Reagan's comments that this was a preemptive strike to knock out their terroristic capability should be taken with several grains of salt. In fact, Mr. Schultz himself said that it would make them hurt even if we didn't knock out their ability. I don't think it's a preemptive strike at all. I think the American people have to be ready now for a real wave of Libyan terrorism. We're in a war now, and we better be able to be a little tougher than we have been in some past wars, and particularly since this war may be waged not just in a Berlin nightclub, but right in this country.
All right, what do you mean by tougher then? Colonel Gaddafi, if Colonel Gaddafi decides to strike over here, God forbid, but if he does, how can you be tough with him?
I think there's a lot more we can do than hitting a few barracks. I think this whole thing is escalating, and we better be very, very much prepared for it. I think when you have the minority leader of the Senate, Robert Byrd of West Virginia, going on television tonight and giving some quibbles about the War Powers Act, that they didn't consult with them, they notified with them, I think that's disgusting. I think that we are in a real war. I think the American people are behind the president on it, but the question is, are they going to be behind him when there is some bloodshed, perhaps in this country.
They're behind the president as long as he produces the evidence, which he says he has it, and I don't doubt that he has it. There may be some quibbles about that evidence.
Well, I don't know. I hope you wouldn't, as an ex-intelligence man, be quibbling. In fact, I think that people like you, Tom, have caused
wait just a minute.
Wait a minute. Let me
Mr. Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States, and he told us all about the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was all baloney. I'm not saying. I think what President Reagan said is true, but it has to be backed up.
I don't think you can demand him to put up intelligence information, and I think perhaps he said too much already. But I really believe there has to be some faith in the president, and if you don't have some faith in the president, then I think we're going to lose this battle. I think we're in a war now. I don't think we're in any kind of political game.
I have faith in the president, but I would like to see the backup. There is no point in...
You're not entitled to see it.
Look, Americans can't take the word of the president as gospel.
You're not entitled to see it, Mr. Braden.
Oh, you mean we Americans are not entitled to know?
I am saying you must...
We Americans are not entitled to know that when Ronald Reagan says the evidence is irrefutable, we just accept that?
I think you'll have to accept in this case because we cannot. We're in a very tense struggle, and we cannot do away with all our abilities.
You're supposed to be a newspaper man.
Well, I'm an American first, aren't you?
I am a newspaper man, and I would like to see the evidence.
I'm an American first. Well, let me tell you one other thing that bothers me very much, and that's our French allies, our good friends from France, and I think it bothered Cap Weinberger a lot, force these bomber pilots to go some 1,200 miles out of their way each way, 2,400 miles out of their way on a dangerous flight because they would not let us go over the French soil. I think that is something, Tom, that we got to remember. I think that we have to remember that the United Kingdom let the F-111s take off from Britain, but the French wouldn't let us overfly.
The French have been very helpful in other ways. They've been very helpful in in giving us intelligence. The Secretary of State said so.
He was just giving a little diplomatic soft soap. That happened sometime before. It did not happen in connection with this.
You believe Ronald Reagan, but you don't believe the Secretary of State.
Listen to what.
Why don't you ask for the evidence?
Listen to what the Secretary of State. Look at the transcript of what he said, and what he said was this other evidence of being helpful happened sometime before.
Well, why did the French not let us fly over their territory?
I believe that the European allies have been craven. I think they have put the almighty dollar ahead of other considerations, trade with the Libyans, and I think they're going to suffer because the American people are going to vote with their feet on tourism and stay out of Europe. Well, Spain is not one of our old allies. They barely stayed into NATO. We have the base problem coming. That's the last country that I would expect to be cooperative. But the French, I would expect to. And I think also that the British, maybe they were just paying us back for the Falklands, but I think they deserve a lot of credit to let those F-111s fly out of the British bases. And I think Mrs. Thatcher is going to get a lot of trouble from the left in Britain in the days to come.
Well, I don't know. If that one bomber gets back, we'll all be safe.
I hope so.
Thank you, gentlemen. Robert Novak and Tom Braden. We'll continue with more coverage of the U.S. attack on Libya in a moment.
I think there are three nevers to being a winning coach. Never let the press pick your starting quarterback. Never take a last-place team lightly. And really, no matter what the score, never let them see you sweat.
That's what new Dry Idea aerosol is all about. Maximum control. It keeps you drier than the leading aerosol.
Everyone feels pressure. Winners don't let it show.
Dry Idea. Never let them see you sweat.
It takes a real professional to steal your business. We know how to put the strength of steel to work. I'm a Seco builder, and my business is steel buildings. Combining your ideas with Seco's advanced technology, Seco buildings are built for a long life and lifelong savings. And they have another side. They're built to be beautiful. You can trust the strength of steel and the strength of your Seco construction professional.
When you're ready to build, look in the yellow pages for your local Seco builder. Do I hear 3800? Santa Fe?
AT&T is in antiques. With AT&T Alliance teleconferencing service, an antique dealer can easily hold an auction with clients all over the country at the same time, as clear as if they're in the same room.
All right, Chicago, it's yours. Now,
Another reason to choose AT&T long-distance services. Talk with us. AT&T, the right choice.
You won't believe how great it holds.
Your lower dentures.
It's extra hold for lowers.
Finally, I can eat, sing,
even laugh with more confidence.
It's extra hold for lowers.
You won't believe how great it holds your lower dentures without messy ooze.
It's extra hold for lowers. And it's from Fast Teeth. You won't believe how great it holds your lowers.
You won't believe it.
Our next guest, if the word patience, experience, and longevity and historical perspective means anything, Rhode Island Democratic Senator Claiborne Pell, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, certainly epitomizes that. Senator Pell, thanks for rushing in to be with us tonight. The first question is your thoughts.
Well, it's not an event about which I was consulted. We were informed at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Obviously, it was no secret that something was going to happen. We were informed at the White House, Executive Office of the President, this afternoon. My own view is that there are 3 criteria that have to be met for a retaliatory action to be successful. One of them is that it has to be timely, that is, shortly after the action for which it's retaliating. Secondly, it has to be proportional, where you're not vastly outnumbering the number of people that you've lost. And third, it has to be selective, specific, in that only those who should be killed, who we kill, should have had something to do with the terrorist actions. It would be wrong if we killed 1,000 innocent townspeople, and I trust that we've not done that.
Senator, given what you've just said, any gut reactions?
No, I really want to wait and study the casualty results to see, one, how many people will we have lost, how many people will have been killed of the Libyans, how many people also of those who are killed on the Libyan side, how many of them will have had a direct relationship to past terrorist actions, and how many of them will have been just passers-by. If the answer to these different criteria are that only those who were concerned with the terrorist actions have been killed, that it was roughly proportional to our losses, and it was timely, which I think it was, then I would be supportive. But if it does not meet those criteria, then I would be less supportive.
Senator Pell, Rick Moore in Atlanta, sir. About the War Powers Act, earlier tonight, Senator Byrd seemed to be a little upset about how this whole thing had been handled as not having been handled under the provisions of that act. The White House says they consulted with Congress. Senator Byrd said they didn't consult, they told us what they were going to do. What's your feeling?
They did not consult with Congress. I was there at the meeting, and they did not consult with Congress because it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we were informed of the action that was taking place.
So what should have been done in your estimation?
I think so, although I can understand the inhibitions on the part of the administration.
No, I'm asking what should have been done. Should they have consulted Congress before with more information?
I think there should have been some general consultation with Congress prior to that time. They needn't be specific about the date and the time, but there was no consultation whatsoever, at least that I'm aware of, and I was the ranking Democrat in the Foreign Relations Committee.
Senator Pell, Larry Speaks earlier this evening at just about 20 after 7 Eastern Time, right after he said that the attack was over, held a news conference for reporters who repeatedly asked him at what point the president had made the decision to have a U.S. strike against Libya, and Larry Speaks said that wasn't important, that it was an evolving decision. Tell us what you know of that. At what point do you think the president made the final decision, and what do you think went into that decision?
Well, I think what went into that decision were all the intelligence reports to which he was privy, and which really do convince one that the Libyans were involved, not only in that disco bombing in Berlin, but also involved in other terrorist actions. When he put this together in his mind and made the decision to move ahead, he did not say, and I do not know, but it must have been sometime before today, I would have thought.
Sometime today?
Sometime before today.
Before today. You have obviously know much of the material that went into making the president's decision. Would you and your colleagues, do you think, have made the same decision?
I think we all are very different individuals. I doubt if it's a decision that I would not have made that same decision. I think that I would be concerned that when we escalate the violence, they will escalate the violence, and you never know when you start playing chicken back and forth what the outcome will be. So I would have been a bit more cautious, I think.
Senator, my impression is that you're questioning the efficacy of what President Reagan did in ordering the strikes. I'm reminded that the White House indicated tonight that in that meeting with you congressional representatives, both from the Senate and the House, the administration held that briefing upwards of an hour and a half before the strike began, giving you ample opportunity. As the White House indicated, the officials indicated in talking to reporters tonight that if you had any objections, presumably you would have raised them. Did you have objections, and did you raise them?
I certainly said that I did not consider this consultation and was not giving my approval by being there. For the White House to say that that was consultation, that is incorrect and simply is not so.
Do you feel you've been taken?
No, I'm just saying that it's an incorrect statement. They have moved ahead, and I could see their reasons for not informing us. But what is wrong is for them to suggest that we were consulted with.
Senator, is our system wrong? There are many times in a situation like that where a president, as you mentioned earlier, is privy to information that the Congress can't be, the general public can't be because of its secretness. Do you think the system is wrong, should be changed? Do you think he's already gone too far in telling some of the secrets tonight?
Well, I think that in order to give some public support to his action, he's had to show the specific nature of the information he's had. By doing that, there is a danger that some of our sources of intelligence can be compromised. This was discussed at the meeting, and it's one of the disadvantages of being a democracy, an open society. But I think the president was right to give the evidence, not only to the Congress, but to the public at large, as to why he believed the Libyans were connected with that bombing of the disco.
Senator Pell, a quick question requiring, a quick answer. Is Chairman Lugar planning to hold hearings on this?
And he has asked the administration to come up and be with us as soon as possible. I do not know if the administration has yet replied.
Senator, thanks so much for coming in and being with us in our Washington Bureau tonight and sharing your views on the subject. Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island.
And our coverage tonight of the developing story, the U.S. strikes against Libya, continues in just a moment.
The day's looking new and bright, and you're gonna start it right. All you're starting through, the aroma's calling you. The best part of waking up is Folgers in your car.
Mornings are brighter with mountain-grown Folgers because mountain-grown coffee has more enticing aroma than any other kind.
The best part of waking up is Folgers in your car.
Here comes cup of soup.
Nobody makes soup in a cup like Lipton cup of soup. It's good. Nobody makes soup in a cup like Lipton.
Lipton cup of soup. Zesty, hearty, perfectly seasoned. Anytime, any place.
Chicken noodle. Leave it to Mom.
Nobody makes soup in a cup like Lipton. Puts a smile on your face. Cup of soup.
What's it? Tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the United States launched a military strike against Libya. 2 hours ago or so, after the strike was over, President Reagan went on national television. He was followed by Secretary of State Shultz and Secretary of Defense Weinberger. They informed the American people of the president's action.
My fellow Americans, At 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission.
The President has just described an act of self-defense on the part of the United States.
The president said that the decision to strike was based on clear evidence that Libya's Muammar Gaddafi planned the bombing of a nightclub in West Berlin. That happened on April 5th. One American was killed.
Our evidence is direct, it is precise, it is irrefutable. We have solid evidence about other attacks Gaddafi has planned against the United States installations and diplomats and even American tourists. Thanks to close cooperation with our friends, some of these have been prevented. With the help of French authorities, we recently aborted one such attack, a planned massacre using grenades and small arms of civilians waiting in line for visas at an American embassy.
The White House says U.S. jets hit Libya's, quote, terrorist infrastructure in Tripoli and Benghazi. The attack lasted about 20 minutes. Here's how CNN's John Donovan in Tripoli first described the situation.
There is a war that has broken out here within the last half hour. It is 2 o'clock in the morning in Tripoli, just after. There is fighting all over the city. From all over the direction of our hotel, there have been explosions. We can see fires burning in the distance, fires that are lighting up the night sky. Flashes in all directions. Planes have been flying overhead. Tracer bullets are flying off into the darkness trying to pick out those planes.
Administration sources say Muammar Gaddafi's headquarters were targeted, and Libyan radio says tonight Gaddafi's living quarters were hit and several of his relatives were injured. It also says some foreigners were hit during the raid. Libya also claims that 3 U.S. jets were shot down and their pilots were killed by the Libyan people. But Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger says that only one U.S. plane is unaccounted for after the raid, and he refused to say that the plane had been shot down. President Reagan told the nation that self-defense is America's right and its duty.
Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
Just hours after the U.S. completed the military strikes against Libya, CNN's John Donovan, whom you heard earlier in Tripoli, reported that there were more explosions and gunfire that could be heard and seen in the Libyan capital. It's not clear whether the U.S. is involved at all or what exactly is going on in that second round of firing reported by John Donovan. Some key leaders of the Democratic Party, including Senator Edward Kennedy and Walter Mondale, now say that this is not the time to criticize the president for his actions against Libya.
We have to wait to hear from the president. Make a responsible answer until they have the opportunity.
Heard from Larry.
Well, that's fine. I listen to the president, not the president.
We have American lives at stake here. This is a very important, fateful step, and I'm not going to make a comment until I... Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Until I know.
Mr. Mondale and Senator Kennedy were attending a Democratic Party fundraiser in New York tonight, and that's where we got their reaction. Rick.
Well, Chris, ever since 7 o'clock tonight when we first broke this story, we've been hearing reactions from senators and other newsmakers around the country, their opinions about what they feel about the strike against Libya. And we thought it might be interesting to bring you the opinions of the average man on the street. Take a look.
If it's going to help curb the terrorism a little bit, I think sure. I mean, we got to do something, but I don't know if it's going to help.
It's about time somebody got back. I know that's may sound a little redneckish, but there it is. That's the reality.
These terrorism, whether you do it with a hand grenade or from a plane, I think they're all insane.
Something's got to be done. I mean, I don't know if this is the right action, but it was something that was done that may, hopefully, you know, do something to stop it on both sides, you know? I mean, it's just ridiculous, the whole thing. I mean,
that's good. I like to see that reaction.
Why?
Because I think he needs to be stepped on.
I think it was probably going to happen sooner or later, just to the condition of what's been going on over there and probably the antagonistic view of Gaddafi.
Because I think they need a signal that we're just not going to take
you know, the stuff that they're doing, these terrorists. And I think it's a signal to them and other terrorists, wherever they may be.
Oh, that's awful. That scares me. It really frightens me. I don't know. I have no comment right at the moment.
Great. Super. Being a veteran, I think I'm all for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe it's a good thing. I've got mixed reactions.
I don't like what we're doing, you know, but I'm just one person out of, you know, millions and millions of people.
Some random reactions from some Americans to what is happening over in the Middle East. Once again now, let's check in very quickly with our beat correspondents here in Washington. Let's go first live to the White House and our senior man there, Charles Bierbauer. Charles?
Bernie, there is no question that the Reagan administration, in carrying out these raids against Gaddafi, is striking back for past terrorist acts by the Libyans. But here it is described, too, as a preventive or preemptive kind of strike, meant to carry a message most dramatically to Mr. Gaddafi to end his reign of terrorism against Americans. Both the President and Secretary of State George Shultz tonight told us that not only was the evidence clear linking Libya to the discotheque bombing in Berlin in which one American was killed, but clear, too, that the Libyans were planning other attacks against American facilities. 30 American embassies are targets, according to Secretary of State George Shultz. Secretary Shultz said that in carrying out these raids, the U.S. hopes to reduce Libya and Mr. Gaddafi's capability of carrying on terrorist attacks, and at the same time to register the point with Gaddafi and with other Libyans that there is a price to pay for being terrorists for attacking the United States. We don't know that price at this point. The damage assessments are not in. We know that most of the American planes have gotten back safely. We do know that there must be some significant damage in Libya. But what we do know is the rate with which this whole confrontation between the United States and Libya has escalated. President Reagan said that he disagreed with the suggestion that the way to treat Gaddafi is to ignore him rather than to give him more attention. He said that for years Gaddafi had gone with no sanctions imposed against him. Early in the Reagan administration, back in 1981, Libyan diplomats were kicked out of the United States and some economic sanctions imposed. Then early this year, rather strict economic sanctions were imposed against Libya. No dealings to be had with the Libyans. All Americans supposed to, ordered to leave, told that if they stayed in Libya, it was at their own risk. Clearly, one reason for that, it was that there would be, or it was hoped at least here at the White House, that there would be no American hostages available in Libya for Mr. Gaddafi. The sense being that the Reagan administration knew that this whole confrontation with the Libyans was going to escalate. Then we had the Gulf of Sidra confrontation, the Americans striking at Libyan bases, and now this. And the final point, the president saying, we've done what we had to do. If necessary, we'll do it again. The objective, to give Gaddafi the incentive to stop. For more on how these raids were carried out, Carl Rochelle is at the Pentagon.
Charles, we thought all was quiet over there, but John Donvan, filing a live report some time ago, in the last half hour, heard live gunfire, and we heard the live gunfire too, machine gun fire and apparently some other sort of small arms fire. We checked with officials here at the Pentagon, and they said that is news to us. Now, there is speculation that might come from a couple of different sources, one of which is that the Libyans, Libyan military were actually firing up in the air purely for public consumption. Another is that the F-111 that is missing could have gone down in the waters in that area. Airplanes from some of the carriers in the area could be conducting search and rescue missions, either looking for the downed pilots, the downed plane, or having found him trying to get the two-member crew out of there. The mission apparently went off without a hitch, except that one incident, the F-111 going down. U.S. sent 18 F-111s from England into the area to hit targets in the western region of Libya, and roughly 15 or 16 A-6s and A-7s from the carriers in the area. Secretary of Defense said all but one of the F-111s had been accounted for.
Or any one of a number of explanations. It could have radio trouble. It could be going to another base because of the radio trouble. It could have had an internal problem, an internal explosion. But there's no indication that it went down or it was a victim of any enemy fire or anything of the kind.
In all probability, the F-111 is down somewhere, but that does not mean that the crew is lost. We hope to have word on that sometime before the evening is over. There are officials on standby here at the Pentagon who, if they get that information, will pass it along to us. But again, remember, it's a long way, a lot of miles, and the communications are not the best in the world coming out of there. The planes going in hit 5 targets. I'd list them for you. In Tripoli, they hit the main headquarters of the Libyan planning and direction of its terrorist attacks overseas. In Benghazi, an alternate command post to the Ali Azia barracks. The Sidi Bilal port facility, a training base for Libyan commandos. The military side of the Tripoli airport, IL-76 aircraft transport, military and subversive material around the world from there. And the Benina military airfield, a military suppression target, home base for military and subversive material used in the war against Chad. Now, military suppression target is a key word, and Defense Secretary Weinberger said apparently the power was out there, the radar was out there, and there was no fighter response from the Benina military airfield. That's probably where Libyan fighters would have scrambled from, if any had scrambled. Damage reports are incomplete. They're very sketchy at this point, but the Secretary said they hope to have better information around 2 o'clock Eastern time when the F-111s get back to their base in England. They are flying back that way. They'll be using air-to-air refueling as they did when they were making the journey. Roughly 3,200 miles each way they flew. There were other planes in the area assisting not only in the fighter cover, but also electronic warfare and command and control planes. All of this is likely to cause a great deal of reaction on Capitol Hill, some already coming our way. For a report on what that is, here is Linda Tyra on Capitol Hill.
Members of Congress were summoned to meet with the president at 4 o'clock this afternoon, 3 hours before the military strike against Tripoli. According to those present, there was general support for Mr. Reagan, but at least a few members expressed some concern about what was to happen, whether it was the prudent course of action. Shortly after the White House announced the operation had occurred, Senate leaders disputed the wisdom of the strategy.
I think the president's taken the right action. It's to an effort to deter future aggression, terrorism by the Libyans. It was an act of self-defense against future terrorism as provided for in the UN Charter. The president will comply with the War Powers Act.
The question is, where do we go if Gaddafi reacts by ordering more acts of terrorism? Is it going to be tit for tat? Suppose Syria or Iran conduct acts of terrorism. What are we going to do then?
Senators Byrd and Dole also disagree over whether the president properly notified the Congress under the provisions of the War Powers Act. Although acknowledging that it is a very close question, Senator Bob Dole said he believes there was substantial compliance by the administration with the War Powers Act. On the other hand, Senator Byrd stopped short of saying the president violated the War Powers Act, but he expressed concern that the administration did not consult with Congress, but rather it notified Congress only after it had firmly made up its mind to go ahead with the military strike. On this point, Senator Dole again takes issue, arguing that the administration was ready to abort the military strike if members of Congress had expressed strong feeling against it. But according to Senator Dole, at that meeting of congressional leaders with White House leaders, there was no such opposition expressed, and so the White House went ahead with it. These questions will be debated over the next few days as Congress and the administration grapple with this new chapter in American foreign policy. Linda Tyra reporting live from Capitol Hill.
Linda, let's take what you've just reported on this new chapter and bring in Charles Bierbauer. Charles, I'm sure you were listening to Senator Claiborne Pell, Rhode Island Democrat, member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He indicated that he did not take his presence at the briefing given to the leaders of Congress this afternoon as consultation.
Well, this is going to be an issue that'll be debated between the administration and those members of Congress who don't feel they've been in on this sufficiently from the first steps, and I think we'll hear more and more of that as time goes by. It's kind of regrettable in the sense, Bernie, that every time something like this happens, that the debate in some measure at least turns on who told what to whom and whether Congress was consulted. And in some sense, I think the question of propriety in those very finely detailed words of legislation seem to crop up, and some of the acts themselves that we're talking about tend to get obscured in the minutiae. I think that the administration did in this case bring down a number of leaders, but not so much to consult as to inform. Maybe Mr. Senator Pell has a point there. The administration would seem to have had its mind made up several days ago. In fact, even at the president's news conference last week, when he said, when the evidence is clear, then we will take action, and they were very pointedly moving in that direction, already tipping their hand to suggest that they had substantial evidence and that it pointed most directly at Mr. Gaddafi and at Libya, and it was just a matter of getting all the, as we say, ducks in a row until they were ready to shoot.
Charles, if we could, while we've got you on camera, get your view on another subject. Earlier tonight, Ralph Begleiter over at State said that folks over there were saying some things that were unprintable about our allies in Europe. What do you feel will be the reaction, since France apparently would not let us overfly to make the strike shorter, more efficient?
We know that the Reagan administration has for some time had great difficulty with its European allies. In fact, even at the president's news conference last week, when he said, when the evidence is clear, then we will take action, and they were very pointedly moving in that direction, already tipping their hand to suggest that they had substantial evidence and that it pointed most directly at Mr. Gaddafi and at Libya, and it was just a matter of getting all the, as we say, ducks in a row until they were ready to shoot.
Charles, if we could, while we've got you on camera, get your view on another subject. Earlier tonight, Ralph Begleiter over at State said that folks over there were saying some things that were unprintable about our allies in Europe. What do you feel will be the reaction, since France apparently would not let us overfly to make the strike shorter, more efficient?
We know that the Reagan administration has for some time had great difficulty with its European allies getting them to take any kind of concerted action against Libya. That even goes back earlier this year when the president invoked those economic sanctions. The European allies did not get in line behind him and stand up against Gaddafi. Too many of them seem to have stronger economic ties to Libya than does the United States, and they're not about to jeopardize those. Pretty selfish, perhaps, from their point of view, but they get their oil from different places than does the United States. As for the events tonight, clearly Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, was behind it. She had to give permission, at least, to use those NATO bases, which the Americans and the British share over in England, for the F-111s to take off from there on such a mission. That permission was granted. And the reason they went the roundabout way they did, all the way out to sea around France and Spain and Portugal and then in through the Mediterranean, was simply because the French said, no, you cannot overfly French airspace for such a mission. The French have periodically been troublesome with the U.S. on these kinds of issues, and will probably continue to be for a long period. But it is certainly clear that the U.S. does not have a universal backing from its allies on this question, even though Secretary of State Shultz tonight seemed to want to suggest that the allies were getting behind.
Charles Bierbauer, let me turn to Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon to touch a little bit more on the mission that you've just briefly outlined. The planes which flew from Britain, the F-111 fighter bombers, had to go around Europe to get to the Mediterranean, where they coordinated with the attack planes that were launched from the aircraft carriers. Carl, tell us a little bit from what you've been able to gather this evening about the nuts and the bolts of these airstrikes, I should put it in the plural tonight, and what went into it.
Well, it's a plan that has been underway for some time, and the aircraft took off from installations at Mendenhall, Lakenheath, and Upper Haber in England. They took off some time ago. These planes have roughly a 3,100-mile range with their auxiliary fuel tanks on board, but I think you can probably rule out the auxiliary fuel tanks because I'm sure they were carrying a full load of weapons. And en route, they were refueled by some of the Air Force's huge tankers, the KC-135 tankers, which also had been flown into England for this, and some of them, of course, are already stationed there. What they did is probably sent them out a few hours in advance because they're a bit slower than the F-111s. The F-111s caught up with them. The airplane that flies roughly Mach 1.5, depending on whatever altitude you're at. That's down around sea level, probably around 750, 800 miles an hour. It can get up close to 2,000 miles an hour if it gets up 50 or 60,000 feet. Got a nice cruising range, and it comes in and carries a lot of armament. The Secretary of Defense said it dropped laser-guided and other precision-type bombs. Some of them are guided by radar signals. Some of them are guided by a laser sight device that sees in the dark. It's sort of infrared, If you recall the pictures we showed you earlier in the week of the Harpoon missile hitting a Libyan patrol boat, it's something along the lines of that, a fuzzy white picture on a dark background, and you can see the missile as it comes in, and they can use that as an aiming system. That's what the F-111s did. We're familiar with the A-6s and the A-7s, the aircraft off of the aircraft carriers. They flew in their missions. They were all coordinated together. Up in the sky above that, you saw something that the Navy often refers to as a super FUD. It's the big brother to a Willy FUD. And now to explain that, if you ever see an aircraft flying along and it's got a big round disc like this on the top of it, that's the aircraft they're talking about, an E-2C Hawkeye. It's the Navy's version of an AWACS aircraft, and it has enough radar to probably control all of the civilian aircraft in the Boston-Washington corridor, which is quite a bit. It can read signals on the ground. It can pick up aircraft as they begin to roll along the ground if there is any response and track them all the way out. It can control the aircraft that are in the air, vector them onto targets. It can do things like link up the F-111s with the air refueling tankers. It can give them a steer to take them right into it. There was fighter cover. They didn't talk a great deal about fighter cover, but there are F-14s and F-18s on board the carriers. And as we speculated earlier in the week, any participation by the F-111s would probably count on top cover from the Navy planes in the area. How the Libyans responded, we have only what we heard from John Donvan to go on. He did hear anti-aircraft fire. There was some indication that some missiles had been fired. There was no indication whether the F-111 that apparently is lost was hit, whether it had some sort of malfunction. It is not necessarily true that a hit would knock an aircraft out of the sky. Sometimes they do completely, sometimes they don't. Yes, a question?
No, Carl, we'd just like to pull away from you
with
your permission and quickly go up to Capitol Hill. Linda Tyra, I recall almost 2 decades ago, there was a great ballyhoo in this town, especially between the White House and Capitol Hill. At that time, the issue was the very famous Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I recall that Democrat Wayne Morse of Oregon, Ernest Greening of Alaska were the only 2 members of the Senate to vote against the resolution. Clearly, the Democratic leadership in the Senate is demurring tonight about what the president has done. Is there a strategy? What are they about?
At this point, the Democrats are clearly disturbed about whether they were properly consulted. The question, as Senator Byrd says, is not whether we were consulted. He says we were just notified that the administration had clearly made up its mind and merely went through the motions of calling this meeting between House and Senate leaders. At this point, the strategy merely is to wait and see, basically by the light of day, what has happened in Tripoli after we are able to determine what exactly has happened, what targets have been hit. Senator Byrd was saying that sometimes operations have to be conducted in utmost secrecy and that the secrecy has to be maintained up until the last minute to protect the integrity of the operation, not to jeopardize it. And in this case, he said perhaps that was reasonable justification for the administration behaving as it did, notifying, in his words, rather than consulting Congress. Senator Byrd and Senator Pell appear to be wanting to wait and see what happens by light of day rather than jumping flatly on the administration, scolding them. Senator Byrd did stop short of saying that the president violated the War Powers Act, but clearly there is some great concern here in Congress over whether the Reagan administration should have said something earlier. There was some question asked, well, if they had said something earlier, what would Congress have done? And the answer came that, well, perhaps Congress would have passed a resolution. But then if Congress had passed a resolution, perhaps the Reagan administration would not have gone ahead with the attack. At this point, there may be some hearings to come, perhaps before the Foreign Relations Committee, at least in the Senate, and we will have to wait and see until we get further details from Tripoli as to what exactly transpired there.
Linda Tyra, thanks for that developing perspective to this moment on what's happening on Capitol Hill, also to our correspondent at the Pentagon, Carl Rochelle, and our senior White House correspondent, Charles Bierbauer. When we return with our extensive coverage of this breaking story, we will hear from a man who once was the commander of the 6th Fleet, retired Admiral Carroll. We'll be back in a moment with that interview.